Radical ideologies often cross the line of common sense, causing their followers to lose touch with reality. It's even worse when the victims of manipulation sincerely begin to believe in the illusions imposed on them. One example of the tragic consequences that blind faith in destructive ideas can lead to occurred in Sweden, a country that has always been considered one of the safest in the world due to its extremely low level of violent crime. In the small Swedish village of Björnberg, on July 27, 1971, a boy named Helge Fossmo was born into a family that was not particularly religious. He became one of 5 children in the family. Despite the lack of religious upbringing, at the age of 12, Helge independently became interested in the church and joined a local youth religious group, becoming one of its most active participants. Although his parents did not share their son's enthusiasm, they did not hinder him, believing that it was not the worst occupation for a teenager. According to Helge himself, it was from the moment he joined the church community that his life acquired true meaning, and he found a kind of salvation in faith. For the next 5 years, the young man completely devoted himself to religion, constantly attending church services and participating in various church events. In 1988, fate led Helge to a cafe for Christian youth, where he met his future wife, Helen Johansson. The young couple got married as soon as they came of age and settled in the town of Bordenberg. The couple had 2 children, and Helge continued to delve into religious issues, becoming a preacher in the local community. However, in 1993, a fateful meeting took place that radically changed the life of Helge and his family. The man met Åsa Waldau, a charismatic leader of a Christian sect known as the Bride of Christ. Åsa came from the tiny town of Knutby, where her teachings originated, with the intention of opening a branch of her church in Bordenberg. Knutby is such a small settlement with a population of about 700 people that there is only one store, one restaurant, a church, and a few dozen wooden houses scattered among the forest. It would seem that in such a cozy corner, there is no place for evil. But it was here at that time that people lived who later committed 3 horrific murders that overshadowed the crimes of many serial killers in their scale and cruelty. Åsa traveled from town to town, preaching her teachings and recruiting new followers, especially among young people. She masterfully manipulated people's minds, urging them to give up everything worldly and devote their lives to serving her church. Helge's family turned out to be an ideal target for the ambitious Bride of Christ. Helge's first meeting with Åsa did not go quite smoothly. The devoted Christian expressed doubts that a woman could be a pastor. However, thanks to her remarkable manipulative abilities, Åsa managed to convince the Fossmo family to join her sect, not suspecting what tragic and irreversible consequences this would lead to. Skeptical of Åsa's radical views and methods, especially after realizing her affiliation with a sect, Helge initially rejected the idea of joining the Bride of Christ community. However, the ambitious preacher did not give up. She was interested in attracting the young Fossmo couple to her ranks, so she acted cautiously and methodically. Over the next 4 years, Åsa gradually gained the trust of Helge and Helen, convincing them of the safety of her church's activities. At the same time, she promoted her own teachings, which increasingly captivated Helge. Eventually, in 1997, the couple agreed not only to join Åsa's community, but also to move to the town of Knutby, where her church was located. At first, the move was presented as an ordinary, friendly visit. Åsa showed the young family her church from the inside, told them about its activities and goals. Gradually, she increasingly gained the attention of her new followers, criticizing the shortcomings of the traditional church, which eventually sowed a seed of doubt in Helge's mind. A significant part of the residents of Knutby already belonged to Åsa's religious community and were involved in various areas of the church's activities. The organization provided work for everyone who wanted it, and almost every member of the community had their own responsibilities, often related to religious service. This brought people together who knew each other well, supported and protected their own. The community gladly accepted the new preacher Helge and his family into their ranks, Having become a pastor of the church in Knutby, Helge quickly drew attention to himself with unconventional motives in his sermons. He often spoke on taboo topics such as sex and death, interpreting them rather dubiously. Despite the fact that not all parishioners shared the radical approach to the interpretation of Scripture, Helge relentlessly pursued his mission. 2 years after the move, the Fossmo family had their third child, which increased the burden on the parents. They decided to hire a nanny, Sarah Svensson, who had recently moved to Knutby, inspired by Asa's teachings. Sarah had grown up in a deeply religious Christian family, but from childhood suffered from severe allergies, which limited her life. The girl was cared for by her mother, with whom she had a very close relationship. But at the age of 11, Sarah lost her mother due to a long illness. This event devastated the girl, turning her into a troubled teenager who often ran away from home. After his wife's death, the entire burden of raising his daughter fell on the father. Despite all his efforts, the man could not fully replace Sarah's mother, although they also had a close bond. The girl stayed with her father until she accidentally met Asa during her travels around the cities in search of new followers. Their acquaintance took place at Bible courses and quickly grew into a close friendship. Sarah turned out to be an ideal candidate for recruitment into the sect. For the experienced manipulator Asa, it was not difficult to discern the girl's vulnerable spots and skillfully use them to lure her into her community. Eventually, Sarah decided to move to Knutby to be closer to the church and comprehend the ways that Asa preached. During this period, Helge became closer to Asa than ever before. They spent a lot of time together, not only delving into the study of Scripture. This couple claimed to receive divine messages, which they interpreted as prophecies. Helge diligently wrote down these revelations in his diary, describing in detail the visions, sensations, and their interpretation. One of these records stated that God named Helge the King of Kings and Asa the Queen of Heaven. According to the pastor, he appeared in the world even at the time of the creation of the world, and since then had been waiting for a meeting with an equal being, Asa. The woman, in turn, insisted that she should marry Helge, because their union would elevate the alternative religion to an incredible height. Both unreservedly believed in these ideas. In 1999, they arranged a kind of sacrament, the wedding ceremony of Helge and Asa. The man gave her a ring with 7 diamonds, because this number has a sacred meaning in many faiths. And all this despite the fact that Helen was still the official wife of the pastor. Of course, such a course of events caused unbearable jealousy on the part of Helen, which led to a rift in her relationship with her husband. Then Asa intervened. She criticized the young wife for jealousy, calling this feeling the most shameful for a true Christian. The sect leader insisted that Helen should change her attitude, otherwise the community would find a way to create serious problems for her. In particular, to take away the house. The intimidated woman was forced to come to terms. The relationship between Helge and Asa took on an increasingly strange hue. Despite the fact that the pastor was still officially married, he hardly engaged with his family, spending all his time with Asa. This became especially noticeable after their sacrament. The woman constantly showered him with love and praise, attaching him to herself more and more. Asa skillfully used Helge's devotion not to build a strong relationship or even to separate him from his wife. Her only goal was to establish complete control over the man. Acting insidiously and effectively, she quickly achieved her goal. Helge found himself completely dependent on her. Asa knew everything about him, and sex, which they constantly engaged in, became the most powerful weapon of manipulation. At the same time, the sect leader convinced the pastor that he could literally embody Jesus. All these absurd ideas multiplied like a snowball, and the behavior of Helge and Asa became more and more outrageous and abnormal. Neither Helen, nor the children, nor other members of the community could influence this situation. Given Asa's manipulative nature, tensions in the Knutby community grew steadily, portending inevitable tragedy. In December 1999, the town was gripped by an epidemic of illness, which did not spare the Fossmo couple. Confined to bed by illness, Helga and Helen were forced to transfer most of the household chores to nanny and housekeeper Sarah Svensson, who miraculously escaped infection. On the morning of December 18th, despite feeling unwell, the couple had breakfast together, after which an exhausted Helge decided to lie down to rest. Having fallen fast asleep, the man heard a knock at the door through his dream. Upon waking up, he found that his wife was nowhere to be found. It turned out that a concerned neighbor had come to their house, who had not heard any news from the couple all day. Helge assured the neighbor that everything was fine, but he insisted on seeing Helen. The woman did not respond to loud calls, although she definitely had to be at home. Remembering that his wife was going to take a shower, Helge became worried about her long absence. The men decided to check what had happened. Since Helen did not respond to her name, they had to break the lock with a screwdriver. In the overflowing bathtub, they found the lifeless body of a woman floating face down. The door was locked from the inside, and Helen was still wearing the nightgown she had worn at breakfast. Helge's eerie scream attracted the attention of several neighbors who ran to the house. Together, they pulled the body out of the water and tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it was too late. 27-year-old Helen was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed that the deceased woman had a serious head injury that could well have been fatal. The forensic expert suggested several possible causes of death. Obviously, the resulting traumatic brain injury could lead to loss of consciousness and, as a result, drowning of the young mother. Even more questions were raised by the results of a toxicological examination, which revealed an extremely high dose of opioids in the victim's blood. According to calculations, this amount of drugs would be enough to kill Helen, but the woman never took any drugs. Despite all the signs of a possible murder, law enforcement officers classified this case as an accident. They concluded that Helen slipped, fell, and hit her head on the faucet. Sarah Svensson's testimony played an important role in this, confirming every word of the pastor that his wife was alone in the bathroom and no one could kill her. Helge appeared grief-stricken and sincerely saddened by the loss of his beloved wife. However, those who knew him more closely noticed some strange changes in the behavior of the widower. In particular, he almost immediately got rid of all the things associated with Helen and never mentioned her again, even forbidding the children to talk about their mother. Some suspected that Helen's death was not an accident, but that the unwanted wife was simply gotten rid of so that she would not interfere with ambitious plans. In addition, it became known that the man personally influenced the conclusion of the forensic medical examination. At first, Helge, citing religious beliefs, demanded that an autopsy not be performed at all, but he was refused due to the suspicious circumstances of the death. Then the preacher insisted on removing information about the presence of opioids in the blood of the deceased from the conclusion. He explained his demand by the desire to minimize the likelihood that his wife could have committed suicide, because it is a sin because of which her soul will not go to heaven. With these dubious actions, Helge allegedly sought to protect Helen's memory and the reputation of his family from shame. Suddenly, during this period, Asa lost interest in Helge. Their stormy romance was cut short when she once again went on a pilgrimage and decided not to return. Unfortunately, the charismatic leader managed to thoroughly brainwash the pastor, who was filled with determination to continue on the path of the sect. Despite the ostentatious grief and tears, Helge very quickly found a new love in the person of Asa's sister, Alexandra Waldau. The relationship between the lovers developed rapidly, greatly facilitated by Helge's high status. At that time, many considered him a person close to God, so they treated him with great respect, which also bribed Alexandra. Already in the spring of 2000, she moved into the pastor's house and soon they got married. However, even a new marriage did not curb Helge's sexual appetites. One woman was always not enough for him, so already in the spring of 2001, he began to actively court the nanny of his children, Sarah Svensson, who still worked in his house. The girl readily accepted signs of attention from such a respected man. Their relationship even received a blessing from the sect leader Asa Waldau. By the time these events unfolded, Helge's relationship with Alexandra had deteriorated. Nanny Sarah, who became the pastor's lover, tried to support him in solving family problems. Helge cynically took advantage of the girl's sympathy, often inviting her to pray together in the church. During these prayer meetings, the man often inclined Sarah to intimacy, insisting that this had nothing to do with satisfying carnal desires, but was a kind of spiritual union and a message to God. So strong was Sarah's belief in Helge's righteousness that she willingly believed these stories and even felt some kind of divine inspiration at such moments. The girl sincerely believed that she was doing a godly deed, although in fact she fell into the trap of a skilled manipulator who covered himself with spiritual values, having goals far from religion. Shortly after the beginning of this relationship, Helge began to voice increasingly contradictory statements. At first, he declared that the Lord was waging his battles on earth, and the pastor himself was his warrior. According to Helge, this mission was not easy, because sometimes it was necessary to remove various obstacles along the way. The man spoke in riddles, and the naive Sarah, who perceived her lover's sermons as divine revelations, willingly believed everything. In fact, Helge was gradually probing the ground for the implementation of his insidious plan. Later, the pastor began to tell that during sex, God sends him important messages about the fate of his second wife, Alexandra. Helge interpreted these signs as a portent of her imminent death. Brainwashing Sarah, he claimed that the Lord had shown him the ideal life companion, herself, the nanny. Moreover, Helge intimidated the girl by saying that he himself could die if his marriage to Alexandra was not dissolved. Although during this period their union was falling apart at the seams, the pastor could not get a divorce due to strict church rules. Like all the women in Helge's entourage, Sarah was enchanted by his stories. With these bizarre messages, he gradually led the nanny of his children to commit a terrible act. The skilled manipulator managed to firmly tie the victim to himself, using his authority in the church and knowledge of Sarah's vulnerabilities. Helge adopted many techniques of such control from Asa, and now willingly put them into practice. At that time, many people seriously considered the pastor to be the person closest to God, so it was not difficult for him to persuade the nanny to his side. According to Helge, the girl had to help the Almighty in the battle with demons, for which she needed to move in with him, despite the fact that he was still living with Alexandra. The women lived in different rooms, and Helge had sex with both of them every night in turn, each time justifying it as a fight against evil spirits. The pastor called intimate relationships a ritual of purification from defilement. His eloquence allowed him to convince his mistresses that he was a messenger of heaven, and in this way opposed the enemies of the Lord. These peculiar three-way relationships lasted until 2003, although Helge already wanted to get rid of Alexandra, with whom he allegedly broke up, but could not officially divorce. During this period, the manipulation of Sarah reached its apogee. For the most part, Helge turned to her only for sex, and the rest of the time he insulted her, calling her a sinner and an arrogant blonde. But each time he ended the emotional torture with the phrase, "I love you." The girl was so happy with these three words that she stopped paying attention to all the insults. She was willing to do anything to earn the favor of the chosen one of God, a fighter against demons, not even noticing how, along with this, she was losing her own will, turning into a puppet in the hands of a dangerous man. Against the backdrop of problems with his second wife, Helge repeatedly asked his mistress if she was ready to kill in the name of the Lord. If earlier Sarah hesitated with the answer, now, it seemed, she reacted more calmly, and the pastor felt that he would soon be able to persuade her to do it. The girl replied that she was not ready, but resisted much weaker than before. Then, to push Sarah on the true path, Helge created a new account in the messenger and began sending her messages from an unknown number, trying to convince her that it was God himself who wanted to contact her. In these creepy correspondences, the girl was told that she had little time left and she had to kill in the name of the Lord no later than November 25th. When Sarah suspected that Helge was behind these messages, he angrily denied his involvement, once again shaming his mistress, accusing her of a lack of faith and sinfulness. Unfortunately, it worked as it had before. Afterward, the pastor began sending Sarah messages that she should become part of the divine plan, sending human souls to heaven. This alleged God claimed that for her, this was the only way to salvation. Helge's manipulations and intimidation led Sarah to begin to fear for her soul and dare to commit a crime. On November 8, 2003, she broke into the pastor's house and attacked his wife Alexandra, who was sleeping in her bed. Sarah hit her with a hammer, but the woman miraculously managed to survive and fight off the attacker. The reason for the attack was a message that Sarah allegedly received from God via messenger. It contained an order to immediately kill the preacher's wife. Oddly enough, the criminal escaped punishment, probably due to Helge's insistence not to report the incident to the police. Indeed, no record of this event was found in the law enforcement database. Instead of punishment, the pastor expelled his former mistress to live with her own father. However, this did not affect Sarah's correspondence with God in any way, which only fueled her terrifying confidence in the need to kill. Shortly after these events, Helge found a new passion, a neighbor, Linde, who at that time was married to a man named Daniel. Having decided to get rid of a competitor, the preacher began sending messages to Sarah, manipulating her in the same way as before. The frightened girl, seeking salvation, again agreed to take up arms. This time, Sarah prepared more thoroughly. She bought a pistol and even researched on the internet how to make a homemade silencer. Following the instructions of the Almighty, she hoped for success and the liberation of her soul. On January 10, 2004, at 3:30 in the morning, Sarah, keeping in touch with Helge, drove up in her father's car to the area where the pastor lived. Having parked 500 meters from the house, the killer put on a black mask and put on shoes of different sizes to throw the police off the trail. Entering through the unlocked door, the lock of which the organizer of the crime broke in advance, staging a robbery, Sarah crept into the room of 23-year-old Alexandra, who was sleeping soundly. Having shot first in the thigh and then, when the victim woke up and screamed, in the head, the criminal killed the woman. At 4:30 in the morning, Sarah went to the house of the second victim, Daniel, the husband of Helge's new mistress. The pastor knew that the man was left alone that night and told Sarah about it. The doors were locked, so the girl just knocked. When 30-year-old Daniel opened the door, she shot him in the chest without hesitation, and when he fell, once more in the head. Fleeing from the crime scene, Sarah did not suspect that the second victim had survived. Daniel managed to get to the phone and call for help. Arriving at the call, the police found him conscious, so he was able to describe the attacker. At that moment, 32-year-old Helge was already at the crime scene, allegedly trying to help his neighbor. Helge accompanied the wounded Daniel to the hospital, where he learned about the murder of his wife Alexandra. The pastor again began to play the role of a grief-stricken husband. The description of the attacker provided by Daniel was rather confusing due to the mask on her face. Gradually, attention focused on Helge and Sarah. One of the neighbors, whose brains had not yet been washed, recalled similar strange circumstances of the death of the pastor's first wife. Information also surfaced about the hammer attack on Alexandra, during which she nearly died at the hands of Sarah. The bloody fingerprints found at the scene of Alexandra's murder and on the door of Daniel's house became irrefutable proof of the 26-year-old nanny's guilt. Sarah was immediately arrested. At first, she insisted that she acted independently, without anyone's prompting, and then began to claim that she committed crimes in the name of God. During a search of Sarah, a phone was seized, where Helge's number and another unknown subscriber were found. Although no correspondence with the Almighty was found on this device, the detectives came across a call from Sarah's old number. Thorough searches of her house revealed another mobile phone, which stored more than 1,000 text messages with God. These messages contained intrusive manipulation and incitement to murder. After tracking the unknown number, the investigation led to the pastor of the local church. Learning about this, The disappointed Sarah, who sincerely believed in the divine origin of the correspondence, told the police the whole truth. The wounded Daniel's wife, Annette Linde, was also suspected of complicity and arrested, but 2 weeks later, she was released without charge. During the trial, the arrogant Helge denied his involvement and showed no remorse. A psychiatric examination found him sane. The scale of the manipulations was staggering. Having sufficient evidence, the prosecutor's office proved Helge's guilt in inciting the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life. In July 2004, the pastor was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 24 years. Despite several appeals that were rejected, Helge will only have a chance for early release in 2028. He was also accused of involvement in the death of his first wife, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence, although the prosecutor is convinced of his guilt. In 2007, while in prison, Helge married for the third time. The identity of his new wife remains unknown. During an interview in August 2006, the imprisoned pastor admitted his involvement in the murder of Alexandra and the attack on Daniel, claiming that several other people were involved in organizing the crimes. However, the case was never reopened. Currently, Helge Fossmo is serving his sentence in the maximum security prison Tidaholm in Sweden. At the trial, a video was shown with a reconstruction of the crime, where Sarah spoke in detail about what she had done. A private investigation revealed that the court was shown an edited version, while the original 6-hour recording contained discrepancies with the actual details of the crime. In interviews with journalists, Sarah adhered to the false reconstruction of events. This raised doubts about the true course of events and the identity of the main culprit. It was assumed that the murderer could be the pastor himself, who shifted the responsibility to Sarah. Sarah Svensson, recognized as insane, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. In 2011, after completing treatment, she was released, as doctors considered her safe for society. In 2020, sect leader Asa Waldau was convicted on 8 counts of assaulting former parishioners and sentenced to community service. The woman changed her last name, moved, and withdrew from church affairs. Thanks to the efforts of doctors, Daniel survived the attack but refused to return to the city, fearing the local church and sectarians. Another pastor of the same church, Urban Feld, was convicted of sexual exploitation of persons dependent on him. Several women from the community whom he called his daughters and manipulated. The moral of this chilling story is that blind faith and fanaticism can lead to terrible consequences, especially when manipulated by ruthless and charismatic individuals. The tragedy in Knutby demonstrates how religious beliefs, taken to extremes, can cloud the mind and push people to the most terrible acts. The main tragedy of this story was not only the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life, but also the ruined lives of all those who fell under the pernicious influence of Pastor Helge Fossmo. Sarah Svensson suffered the most, a young girl who, due to naivety and gullibility, became a toy in the hands of an experienced manipulator. Her sincere faith was cynically used to achieve selfish goals, which led to irreparable consequences. To protect yourself from such situations, it is necessary to always maintain critical thinking and not allow anyone to manipulate your consciousness, even if it is a spiritual leader. You cannot blindly trust authorities and follow instructions that are contrary to morality and common sense. Faith should be a conscious choice, not an instrument of control in the hands of other people. It is important to remember that true religion brings love, mercy, and forgiveness, not hatred, condemnation, and violence. People are capable of horrific acts towards one another, but what could be worse than the cruelty of one's own parents? This is a story about Lacey, a girl whose life was cut short due to the inhumane conditions in which she was kept by her closest relatives. Lacey, we don't know much about her as she rarely appeared in public. According to neighbors' recollections, she was a cheerful, inquisitive child. She was passionate about volleyball, loved watching Disney cartoons, and listening to country music. A typical girl with a carefree childhood. But everything changed when Lacey turned 9. Her family, consisting of her mother Sheila and father Clay, decided to move to a new home in the town of Slaughter, Louisiana. Little did they know that this house would become a real prison for their daughter. When Lacey was supposed to start ninth grade, her parents suddenly decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for the girl, but in reality, it marked the beginning of her isolation from the outside world. I want you to imagine being locked within the four walls of your own house, without the opportunity to interact with peers, go to school, develop, and explore the world. This is the situation young Lacey found herself in, and no one even suspected her suffering. What motivated Sheila and Clay to make such a choice? Did they realize the consequences of their actions? These questions remain unanswered to this day. But one thing is certain, their decision forever changed Lacey's life and led to tragic events. Moving to a new house and switching to homeschooling seemingly ordinary things that shouldn't raise suspicions. But in this case, they became the first steps towards the girl's horrific fate. So at the time of being transferred to homeschooling, Lacey was about 14 years old. It was during this period that her life turned into a real nightmare. The girl found herself in complete isolation from the outside world. As it turned out later, Lacey suffered from autism and a severe form of social phobia. These diagnoses became a life sentence for her. Over the years, the illness progressed, and the girl increasingly immersed herself in her own world, shutting herself off from reality. It can be assumed that it was precisely due to the exacerbation of Lacey's condition that her parents decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for her, that she would feel safer in a home environment. But did they realize the consequences this isolation would lead to? Imagine a teenager who is afraid to step outside their own house, who doesn't have the opportunity to interact with peers, make friends, explore the world. For Lacey, with her diagnosis, it was a real ordeal. She found herself trapped by her own fears and limitations. But this is just the beginning of the tragedies the girl had to face. A girl who needed help and support found herself in complete isolation. And most terrifying of all, it happened through the fault of her own parents. Why didn't Sheila and Clay seek professional help for their daughter? Why did they decide that homeschooling and isolation were the solution? I want you, the one watching this video right now, to know that it's important to be attentive to those who need our help and support. Perhaps if someone had intervened, if someone had reached out to help Lacey, her fate would have been different. Years passed and Lacey became increasingly invisible to those around her. Neighbors who once frequently saw her on the street could now barely remember when they last encountered the girl. It was as if she had vanished behind the walls of her own house. Meanwhile, her parents, Sheila and Clay, continued to live their usual lives. Sheila worked as a court and police clerk and also had a small bakery nearby. It seemed like nothing special, just an ordinary job. But later, just before her daughter's death, Sheila got a job as an assistant prosecutor in Zachary and even became a member of the Slaughter City Council. A successful career, isn't it? And Lacey's father, Clay, was a respected member of the community. He represented the non-profit organization Civil War Round Table and was part of the Rotary Club. People respected him for his active community involvement and participation in city life. The Fletchers were an ordinary family that didn't stand out in any particular way. They irregularly attended the local church like many other town residents. No one could have imagined that behind the closed doors of their house, something terrible was happening. I often encounter situations where people are not always what they seem at first glance. Outwardly, the Fletchers were a respectable family, active members of the community. They didn't raise any suspicions or questions. But as it turned out, it was all just an illusion. While Lacey suffered in complete isolation, her parents continued to live their normal lives. They went to work, interacted with people, participated in community affairs. Meanwhile, their daughter was slowly fading away within four walls, without hope of rescue. Friends, creating this type of content requires a lot of time. And right now, my channel and I are going through a challenging financial situation. I would be immensely grateful if you could become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to your comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become a sponsor. I will be eternally grateful to you. From the moment Lacey was transferred to homeschooling, years passed, and the girl practically disappeared from the sight of those around her. During all this time, she was seen outside the house only once when she was 20 years old. A random passerby noticed Lacey exercising near her parents' house. Perhaps at that time, she still had a bit of freedom and strength to go out into the yard. The Fletcher's neighbor, Robert Blatz, was the last person to see Lacey alive. He recounted that he once spoke with Clay about the girl. He inquired about how she was doing and where she had gone, as she hadn't been seen for a long time. To which Clay briefly replied that his daughter lived with them, she was in the house, and quickly changed the subject. At the time, it didn't raise any suspicions for Robert. He likely knew about Lacey's social phobia and her health issues, so he didn't press further. Moreover, the Fletcher family had an impeccable reputation among neighbors. They were respected members of the community, and nothing indicated any possible trouble. From the perspective of my years lived and experience working in the police force, I often wonder how many tragedies could have been prevented if people were more attentive and caring. In this case, too, the neighbor inquired, received an answer that essentially clarified nothing and left it at that. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions, didn't become alarmed, didn't turn to the appropriate services. Of course, I don't blame Robert. He couldn't have known what was happening behind the closed doors at the Fletcher's house. But it makes one think about how often we, caught up in our own affairs and problems, simply don't notice the warning signs. We don't pay attention to the strange behavior of neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances. We consider it none of our business. Lacey practically vanished from the life of the community, and it didn't bother anyone. The girl who once played on the street and interacted with neighbors suddenly became invisible, and everyone accepted it as a given. One can only imagine the despair and loneliness Lacey experienced during those years. She was imprisoned not only physically within the walls of her own home, but also emotionally in the indifference and blindness of those around her. January 3, 2022, forever changed the lives of the Fletcher family and shook the entire local community. That day, Sheila called the police with a report that was difficult to comprehend. Her 36-year-old daughter Lacey had stopped breathing. How could this have happened? What had been going on in that house all these years while Lacey was isolated from the world? Rumors immediately began to circulate around this incident. Some claimed that Sheila dared to call the police only because someone from the neighbors was in their house at that moment. Allegedly, the very fact of an outsider's presence forced her to act. Otherwise, she would have continued to remain silent. One of the Fletcher's neighbors, who claimed to be in their house on that fateful day, said that Sheila would hardly have called the police if not for his presence. This leads one to wonder whether it was an attempt by the mother to conceal the traces of her terrible negligence and indifference. What really happened on that January day? I'm afraid we will never know all the details. The only thing known for certain is that Lacey was found dead in her own bed, in a house that should have been a cozy shelter for her, but instead became a place of suffering and death. The following days and weeks were filled with investigations, interrogations, and examinations. Local residents whispered and shared speculations, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet communities. However, no one could even imagine the full depth of the tragedy unfolding behind the walls of the Fletcher's house. Frankly, I have seen a lot of human grief and cruelty, but Lacey's story shocked me. Lacey's death marked the beginning of a long and painful process of seeking truth and justice. What law enforcement officers and medics saw in the Fletcher's house that January day will forever remain in their memory. In the living room on the couch, they discovered the body of 36-year-old Lacey Ellen Fletcher, who had been lying there for the last 12 years of her life. The scene that opened before their eyes was horrific. Lacey's body was disfigured by pressure sores, which had likely formed from prolonged contact with the surface of the couch. Her skin was covered in ulcers and her own excrement, indicating a complete absence of basic hygiene and care. The most shocking aspect was that insect larvae and rat droppings covered the girl's body. This suggested that she had literally rotted alive in that spot without any assistance or intervention. Medical experts who examined Lacey's body noted that she had literally grown into the couch. It's possible that the girl had not gotten up from it for so long that her muscles had atrophied and her skin had fused with the surface of the furniture. Lacey's legs were bent under her body in an unnatural position, indicating her immobility for an extended period. At the time of her death, Lacey was wearing only a dirty, tattered t-shirt. She weighed a mere 43 kilograms, which was catastrophically low for an adult woman of her height. Most likely, the girl suffered from severe malnutrition and dehydration, which led to her death. Some sources also reported that the autopsy results revealed the presence of coronavirus in Lacey's body. This was surprising because, according to the testimonies of neighbors and relatives, the only people the girl had contact with in recent years were her own parents. The question arose, could they have been the ones to infect their daughter during the pandemic? When cops began investigating the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, one of the key questions was, what had caused her demise? The answer that investigators received from medical experts was shocking. According to the coroner, Dr. Hasbrook Mims, Lacey had fallen victim to serious medical neglect by her caregivers, her own parents. For years, they had disregarded their daughter's basic needs, leading to a whole range of health problems. Due to chronic malnutrition and acute starvation, Lacey's body was depleted, deprived of vital nutrients. Her muscles had atrophied due to prolonged immobility, resulting in the formation of pressure sores and ulcers on her body. But the most terrifying aspect was that at some point, Lacey developed osteomyelitis, an infectious inflammation of the bone tissue. The pathogens had likely entered her body through open wounds and ulcers. Without proper treatment, the infection spread throughout her body, causing sepsis, a life-threatening reaction of the body to inflammation. Law enforcement also studied information that Lacey might have suffered from locked-in syndrome, also known as pseudocoma. According to some accounts, the girl seemed to be in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak, although her consciousness was alert. But Dr. Hasbrought Mims refuted these assumptions, noting that apart from the previously diagnosed autism and social phobia, no other neurological disorders were detected in Lacey. It is striking that Lacey's last documented visit to a doctor occurred when she was only 16 years old. Just imagine, 20 years without proper medical supervision, without basic checkups and tests. During this time, any disease could have developed and led to fatal consequences. I cannot comprehend how parents could allow their daughter to end up in such a terrible state. After all, they lived with her under the same roof, saw her every day. Were they so blind or indifferent as to not notice the obvious signs of illness and decline? Of course, one could refer to Lacey's mental state, her social phobia, and reluctance to contact the outside world. But this is no excuse for the parents. It was their duty to provide their daughter with proper care and treatment, even if it meant resorting to coercive measures. In May 2022, after a thorough investigation into the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, her parents, Sheila and Clay, were formally charged with second-degree murder. This was the first step towards justice for the girl who had suffered in silence for so many years. Despite the severity of the crime, they spent only 36 hours behind bars. Imagine, accused of their own daughter's death, they were released on bail of $300,000 each. This amount may seem enormous to the average person, but for a couple who held quite high positions in the local community, it wasn't that much. Of course, releasing suspects on bail is a common practice in our justice system. But in this case, it was difficult to come to terms with the fact that people who had brought their own daughter to such a horrible state could calmly await trial in the comfort of their own home. However, even the highest bail could not soften the shock and outrage that gripped the jurors when they were shown footage from the crime scene and photographs of Lacey's body during the court session. Imagine people's reactions to these chilling images. Some couldn't hold back tears, while others turned away, unable to look at the screen. Even experienced lawyers and law enforcement officers, who had seen plenty of brutality in their practice, were stunned by the extent of suffering Lacey had endured. This evidence became irrefutable proof of the inhumane conditions in which the girl had lived the last years of her life. The jurors saw with their own eyes the pressure sores and ulcers on her body, the insects and rodents that had infested her bed, the filth and neglect of the room where she had spent her final days. During interrogations, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction and negligence in caring for their daughter. They told detectives that Lacey suffered from autism and an extremely severe form of social phobia, which only worsened over the years. According to their account, the girl was terrified of leaving the confines of the house and avoided any contact with the outside world. Allegedly, this was why she stayed in her room around the clock, refusing even to get up from the couch. The Fletchers claimed that the crisis in Lacey's condition occurred when she was a little over 20. The girl had supposedly disappeared, completely entirely isolating herself, losing any desire for communication and activity. She would allegedly scream and throw tantrums when someone tried to persuade her to leave her comfort zone. Clay and Sheila insisted that they had made attempts to help their daughter. They claimed to have tried to lift her from the couch, force her to move, but it only worsened the situation. Lacey would allegedly fall into such severe stress and aggression that the parents were simply afraid to change anything. Particularly cynical were Sheila's words about how Lacey never complained about the precious sores and wounds that festered on her emaciated body. The mother claimed that she regularly examined and treated these ulcers, but the girl allegedly didn't want to be bothered. On the one hand, I understood that raising and caring for a child with such serious mental disorders is indeed a difficult challenge for parents. No one is immune to the possibility of the illness progressing and complicating life for the entire family. But on the other hand, before the investigators sat two adult, educated people who had essentially watched their daughter die in her own home slowly, in agony, in filth and loneliness. I couldn't and didn't want to find excuses for them. Even if Lacey truly refused help and contact, shouldn't the parents have taken more decisive measures? Seek medical assistance, call in specialists, resort to involuntary hospitalization? After all, it was a matter of their own child's life and health. Instead, they watched their daughter's slow agony for years. They watched as she died alive among her own waste. And this was despite the fact that they themselves led quite active social lives, pursued careers, and attended church. Throughout the investigation and trial, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction by claiming that Lacey was an adult and therefore had the right to make her own decisions about her life. They argued that the girl had consciously chosen to remain confined to the couch, refusing any activity or assistance. According to the parents' version, they simply accepted their daughter's choice and allowed her to exist in this way. They claimed that Lacey had retained mental clarity and the ability to communicate until her last day, which meant she could have changed her situation if she had wanted to. The Fletchers insisted that they suspected nothing, as they had last seen their daughter alive. They allegedly found her dead when they returned home after a weekend trip. But these statements raised serious doubts for me as an investigator. After all, the condition in which Lacey's body was found clearly indicated that the girl had been dying in bed for more than one day, surrounded by filth, parasites, and her own waste. It couldn't have happened suddenly, over a single weekend. The parents were well aware of their daughter's vulnerable mental state, but had not taken any measures for years to provide her with proper care and treatment. They had every opportunity to take Lacey to a doctor, turn to the appropriate services, arrange for hospitalization, or at least hire a caregiver. Instead, they simply left the helpless woman to fend for herself, dooming her to a slow and painful death. And even when the couple allegedly went on vacation, leaving their mentally ill daughter alone in such a pitiful state, it already amounted to criminal negligence. They should have been aware of the risks and responsibilities they carried as guardians of an incapacitated person. The defense tried to touch the jurors with the image of parents supposedly grieving for their prematurely deceased daughter. They hoped that the respected status of the family and the Fletchers' active community involvement would play in their favor. But the prosecution understood that a cruel truth was hidden behind the mask of respectability. And our task was to bring this truth to the court and secure a just punishment. The prosecutor insisted on a thorough investigation of all the circumstances of the case and the appropriate classification of the Fletchers' crime. In our opinion, their actions fell under the article second-degree murder and should be punished with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And so, after months of investigation, dozens of witness interrogations, examinations, and fierce court battles, we finally reached the denouement of this chilling story. The jury, having heard all the evidence and arguments of the parties, found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of murdering their daughter Lacey through criminal negligence and inhumane treatment. Witnesses remember the tense silence that fell over the courtroom when the presiding judge announced the verdict. It seemed as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation, and when the words "life imprisonment without the possibility of parole" were uttered, one could hear dozens of people sighing with relief in that silence. Justice had finally prevailed, but the joy of victory was overshadowed by the realization of the full tragedy of the situation. Lacey, an innocent, defenseless girl who suffered from severe illnesses, had become a victim of the cruelty and selfishness of those who should have surrounded her with love and care. She died in agony, in complete loneliness, not understanding why such a fate had befallen her. During the announcement of the verdict, a heavy atmosphere filled with grief reigned in the courtroom. People were not ashamed of their tears, not hiding their shock and indignation. The journalists present seemed to not seek sensational headlines. For the first time in many years, they simply silently honored Lacey's memory. I believe that this story was not in vain. The Lacey Fletcher case shook the entire country, forcing people to think about the problems that had remained in the shadows until now. Community activists and concerned citizens rallied to push for changes in the system of protecting the rights of people with disabilities and mental disorders. Thanks to this tragedy, serious discussions began at the state level about guardianship of incapacitated individuals, the accessibility of medical and social assistance, and monitoring the observance of the rights of vulnerable population groups. And although there is still much work ahead, we have moved from a dead end and taken the first steps towards a more humane and responsible society. I know that the memory of Lacey will live on in the hearts of all who empathize with this tragic story. The Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles has a sinister reputation. Over nearly a century of its existence, it has been the site of numerous tragedies and mysterious events. But even against the backdrop of this grim history, the case of Eliza Lamb stands out. What happened to the 21-year-old Canadian student within the walls of the Cecil in 2013 still haunts those seeking the truth. The police investigated this case for a long time, but ultimately concluded that it was a suicide. However, there are far too many puzzling and suspicious elements in this story. It's all too easy to discern the outlines of a deliberate and brutal murder. So, what really happened to Eliza Lamb? Why was her body found where it was found? And most importantly, who killed her and why, if it was indeed a murder? Today, we will try to unravel this mysterious story and separate facts from speculation. Eliza Lamb, a 21-year-old girl originally from China, emigrated to Vancouver, Canada in 2003 with her family, consisting of her father, mother, and sister. Thanks to the large Chinese diaspora living in this city, adaptation was quick for all family members. Soon, the Lamb family rented a small Chinese restaurant and led a quiet, measured life. According to regular patrons of the establishment and neighbors, the immigrant family was welcoming and friendly. Eliza, a brown-eyed girl with dark hair, was fluent in English, although she had vision problems. She was a first-year student at the University of British Columbia, which ranks 40th among 17,000 universities worldwide. The girl was responsible and hardworking, working part-time on weekends and evenings in clothing stores, and later got a job at a bank. Eliza loved to travel, and even the lack of company did not stop her. She independently visited Washington State, Ottawa, Toronto, and Niagara Falls. She dreamed of going to Los Angeles and Hollywood in the near future. In December 2012, Eliza broke up with her boyfriend, and already in January 2013, the diligent student received a Christmas bonus. She told her sister about her desire to go to America to gain new experiences and get rid of the negative feelings associated with the breakup. The funds were there, and the parents did not object. The solo journey began in San Diego, where Eliza arrived on January 22nd, and on the 26th, the girl arrived in Los Angeles and settled in the Cecil Hotel. It is worth pausing at this point and telling the story of the hotel chosen by Eliza. The Cecil was built in the 1920s. It was a 15-story building designed for wealthy people and businessmen. However, the owners later changed their policy, renting out rooms for long periods at low prices. The hotel's reputation rapidly declined. From a pretentious, fashionable establishment, the Cecil turned into a cheap hotel that barely reached 3 stars. The hotel has repeatedly become the final refuge for suicides. In 1954, Helen Gurney, exhausted from fighting a serious illness, threw herself out of a 7th-floor window. In 1962, Julia Moore also jumped from an 8th-floor window due to pregnancy by a man who refused to acknowledge the child and a difficult financial situation. Pauline Otten jumped from a 9th-floor window after an argument with her husband. She fell on top of Georgie Giannini, a passerby. Both died on the spot. Another dark page in the hotel's history was the murder of guest Goldie Osgood, who was found in her room in 1964, brutally beaten and raped. This crime remains unsolved. After the Eliza Lamb incident, journalists began to savor all these facts, calling the Cecil a hotbed of evil and otherworldly forces. But it is worth remembering that the hotel is located next to the troubled Skid Row area. In the 40s, half of all crimes in Los Angeles were committed there. This real tumor of the City of Angels attracted serial killers who simply wanted to be closer to their victims and get lost in the lists of cold cases. As for the suicides, everything is quite prosaic here as well. People who had financial and personal problems often stayed at the hotel with an unfortunate location and low prices. All suicide cases were investigated. Over 90 years of the Cecil's existence, only one murder occurred there, which is not that much. It is hardly possible to confidently state that the hotel is run by evil forces based on one case. This is a typical example of a cheap hotel where criminals and people with mental disorders sometimes stay. Finally, let's return to Eliza Lamb. She checked into the hotel on January 26th and intended to leave on February 1st. According to the employees, the girl behaved normally, did not demand anything, and spent most of her time outside the hotel. So it was not possible to establish exactly what Eliza was doing from January 26th to 29th. On the 29th, she left a text message on Tumblr. I'm staying in a terrible hotel. By the word terrible, I mean tasteless. But it was built in 1928. It's Art Deco. So yeah, the hotel is cool. I think Baz Luhrmann should have filmed The Great Gatsby here. What Eliza did on January 30th is unknown. On the 31st, the staff saw her in the lobby. She was talking to her parents. Around noon, she visited a bookstore. On February 1st, Eliza did not call home. The girl had a particularly strong connection with her family. There was an agreement that she would call them every day, which she did with pleasure. After waiting until the evening of the first day of February, her father called Eliza himself. There was no answer. Then, around 8 in the evening, he called the reception. The duty manager reported that the stay at the hotel had expired on February 1st. Since the reservation was not extended, the staff vacated the room, and her belongings were waiting in the storage room. The manager did not know where their owner was. The Lamb family immediately went to the nearest police station. An officer helped them file a report dated the 1st. On February 4th, the case from the Los Angeles Missing Persons Department almost immediately went to the Homicide and Major Crimes Division. The reason for this decision is unknown, as there was no data on the commission of crimes against Eliza Lamb. Perhaps the police acted preemptively. Or maybe they found coincidences with previous crimes. In any case, the disappearance of the Canadian student was handled by detectives from the most prestigious and competent criminal investigation unit. On February 5th, they arrived at the hotel. On the same day, 2 dog handlers with dogs were called in and began to inspect the building. They even checked the technical floor. This floor could be reached by elevator, but it was impossible to exit without a special key. The roof, which was locked with an electronic lock, was also checked. The opening was recorded on the hotel security alarm panel. There was no data on unauthorized opening or lock breakage. The police decided to play it safe. Search activities involving dogs did not yield any results. Eliza's fate remained unknown. Detectives seized video recordings from the hotel's surveillance cameras, ATMs in the lobby and neighboring buildings, and street camera footage. They had to analyze 800 hours of video recordings from January 31st and February 1st. While viewing the video recordings, the police came across a stunning find. The camera captured the missing girl in the elevator a few hours before her death. Other cameras did not record Eliza Lamb leaving the hotel, so she remained inside. From the data that came from Canada, it became known about Eliza's diagnosed bipolar disorder. This is a veiled name for psychosis, which is characterized by an alternation of 2 states: lethargic, depressed, and excited active. The disease had a mild form, and according to the doctor, did not pose a danger to others or to Lamb herself. She took medication with her on the trip. On February 19th, the story of the missing Canadian student made an incredible zigzag. On the evening before and the morning of the 19th, several hotel guests complained about an unpleasant smell and strange color of the water. The Cecil Hotel had a personal water tower, 4 tanks with a volume of approximately 7,500 liters each, installed on the roof to maintain hydraulic pressure in case of water supply interruptions. The plumber decided to start checking the water quality with them. Inside one of the tanks, half filled with water, he found a floating body. According to him, this happened at 10 in the morning. At 12:49, a patrol officer officially reported that he saw a naked female body in the water. At approximately 1 o'clock, a whole column of firefighters and police officers began to pull the corpse out of the tank. Residents of Los Angeles watched the operation live. The television broadcast was conducted from helicopters of several TV channels. In addition, a whole flock of reporters settled on the roofs of neighboring buildings and near the entrance to the hotel. At 3:45, the body was pulled out of the tank. At 4 o'clock, the identity of the deceased was established. It turned out to be Eliza Lamb. No one doubted this. On the evening of the same day, all residents of the United States learned about the incident. In the water tank, where the female body swollen from decomposition was floating, they found black men's shorts size M, a green t-shirt size L, a set of black lace underwear, a pair of black sandals, a red fleece jacket size XS with a hood and zipper, a wristwatch, and a key card for the Cecil Hotel. The absence of important items is surprising. A wallet, phone, and glasses, which were never found either in the room or near the body. The autopsy, conducted by a forensic expert, brought quite intriguing results. Of the intravital bodily injuries, 2 skin defects were identified under the knees of both legs. Abrasions 2.5 centimeters long on the right leg and about 1 centimeter on the left. It was established that Eliza had sexual intercourse shortly before her death, and drowning did not fit the case of Eliza Lamb's death at all. On the inner side of the eyelids in the sclera, there were pinpoint hemorrhages, a sign of mechanical airway obstruction. The nasal passages were not blocked. This meant that after the body was removed from the water, there was no abundant discharge of foamy liquid from the lungs, and the release of foam is a significant sign of death by drowning. There was no water in the lungs, which means there was no reflex inhalation underwater. The girl got into the tank without breathing or with weakened superficial breathing. But Eliza Lamb's death was announced as a result of drowning. Thus, Lamb's death, which was not a drowning, was still declared a drowning. The police seized the medications that Eliza Lamb took on the trip. Trace amounts of drugs were found in the liver, but the peak of action had passed long before death. They did not cause the death. On June 21st, the Los Angeles police put a bold end to their investigation, concluding that Eliza Lamb committed suicide due to an exacerbation of bipolar disorder. Law enforcement agencies chose the path of least resistance, blaming the victim herself. How familiar this is. I wonder when they will start punishing law enforcement officers for negligence and unwillingness. Despite the fact that the Los Angeles police put an end to the investigation, recognizing Eliza Lamb's death as a suicide due to an exacerbation of bipolar disorder, the public was not quick to agree with this. There were too many strange and incomprehensible things in this story to simply take and believe the official version. Both journalists and people who were simply not indifferent to the event saw a mystical trail in it, the dark intervention of otherworldly forces. But is everything really so mysterious? Perhaps it is worth looking for a more rational explanation. Let's agree with the police conclusion for a minute and consider this case from the point of view of suicidology. People who are prone to suicide have certain characteristic signs of behavior that an experienced specialist will notice immediately. From 70% to 90% of potential suicides in one way or another inform their loved ones, relatives, friends, about their intentions. But Eliza Lamb did nothing of the sort, no alarming conversations or hints. Most women and girls who try to commit suicide do not die the first time. They either get scared at the last moment or just want to attract attention to themselves. Usually, the second or third attempt becomes fatal, although some practice this much longer. But Eliza, as far as is known, did not have any previous suicide attempts at all. The main reason for suicide is unbearable mental and physical pain that a person seeks to get rid of at all costs. But Eliza had a completely legal and effective way to deal with this: individually selected medications that she took under the supervision of a doctor. Why would she kill herself if the suffering could be overcome with medication? By the way, about the doctor. Eliza was being treated by the well-known psychiatrist Sarah Scarf, who had an impeccable reputation and many years of experience. There were never any complaints about her work, which means the diagnosis and therapy were correct. And if Eliza really had suicidal tendencies, Sarah Scarf would certainly have noticed it. After all, suicides, even unconsciously, give a lot of signals that an experienced specialist recognizes unmistakably. But the doctor was so confident in the stable condition of her patient that she calmly let her go on an independent trip abroad. She hardly would have done this if she had the slightest doubts. Yes, Eliza took the medications prescribed to her. So what? This is not at all an indicator of abnormality, rather the opposite. A person who follows the doctor's recommendations and regularly takes medication is usually quite adequate, able to control emotions and cope with stress. Moreover, with bipolar disorder, there are never hallucinations or delusions. Toxicological examination showed that on the eve of her death, Eliza did not drink alcohol or use drugs, and this could have exacerbated the manifestations of the disease. Another argument against suicide is the complete nudity of the body. Women who commit suicide never undress, because even in the last minutes of their lives, the thought that someone will lustfully examine their bodies is unbearable for them. But according to the official version, it turns out that Eliza undressed completely, threw all her clothes into a tank of water, and jumped in there herself. Isn't that strange? Moreover, death by drowning is terrible and painful. If the girl really wanted to end her life, she would have chosen something faster and simpler. Well, at least a jump from the roof. Fortunately, she was there. By the way, guests of this hotel who committed suicide usually jumped from windows, not drowned. Perhaps the key to this strange story lies in the video that captured Eliza Lamb's last minutes of life. The police released this recording on February 13th, but there is one nuance here. In fact, the camera took these shots not on January 31st between 2 and 3 o'clock, as officially stated, but in the first half of February 1st. This was done so that investigators could check the testimony of eyewitnesses about the girl's last day of life. That is, the recording that got on the internet is not the original. So, the recording that got on the internet and caused such a stir is not actually the original. Before making the video public, forensic experts worked on it a lot. Some fragments were slowed down, some were accelerated, the date and time were hidden, and individual moments were cut out. Perhaps this was done because someone who was next to Eliza in her last hours got into the frame, and the investigation decided to hide this information. But even from this castrated video, certain conclusions can be drawn. Let's start with the fact that the girl enters the elevator on the 14th, the highest of the residential floors. She leans towards the buttons, presses them along with the door hold button. She is wearing the same clothes that will later be found at the bottom of the water tank. There are no glasses or, it seems, contact lenses on her. Eliza has to lean over to see the numbers on the buttons. The girl's movements are unhurried. She calmly stands in the corner of the cab. Analysis of her nonverbal behavior proves that Eliza is in a relaxed state, not feeling fear or anxiety. This is evidenced by the position of her arms and legs. It seems that she is waiting for someone, but some time passes, and no one enters the elevator. Then, Eliza approaches the exit, quickly looks out into the corridor, presses herself against the wall, almost in the same place where she was standing before. And a second later, she abruptly steps towards the elevator control panel, presses her back against the wall, as if she wants to be in the zone of invisibility. This maneuver looks more playful than anxious. Body language reveals embarrassment, but not fear at all. However, no one looked into the elevator, so after a short wait, Eliza slowly looks out into the corridor again, watching the part of it to the right of the elevator. The girl glances to the left, probably assuming that the one she was waiting for had already passed while she was hiding in the corner. Then, she jumps out of the elevator on both legs. Experts regarded these actions as foolishness, a game. Eliza clearly did not feel danger and was not really hiding. Further, remaining in the corridor, the girl moves to the left edge of the doors and disappears from the camera's view for a moment. Then, in the frames, you can see the edge of her skirt and part of her shoulder. Eliza slowly raises her arms above her head. Most likely, she is fixing her hair. Analysts see these actions as an expression of sexual interest. Having dealt with her hair, she returns to the elevator. Her arms are widely spread. Lamb is trying to calm down. She is in a state of strong emotional excitement. Many experts note that at this moment, Eliza, strange as it may seem, is laughing. The violent reaction is caused by the fact that someone made her laugh. Again, leaning towards the panel, Eliza begins to press the buttons with both hands. At the end, she presses the door hold again, makes a 1-second pause, and another series of pressing and holding. Having finished with the buttons, The girl exits the elevator, slowly fixing her hair. Opposite the exit is a mirror, and preening in front of it does not at all fit with fear or anxiety. When exiting, Eliza puts her elbows forward. This is how she tries to appear more confident. She stands to the left of the doorway, and although the resolution of the recording is low, experts discerned Lamb is smiling. Perhaps not quite sincerely. Further, the analysis of nonverbal behavior records. The level of insincerity increases along with the level of anxiety. One of the markers is Eliza touching her shoulder with her fingertips. It is clearly visible how she leans over, as if talking to someone standing to the right of the elevator doors. At the same time, the girl actively gesticulates. Experts note excessive playfulness, a playful mood. There are no signs of fear. The eerie moment seems unnatural, only because it is here that the recording was slowed down. Let's not forget that it was worked on a lot. Eliza rises several times on the toes of her right foot. This indicates a remarkable optimism, maybe even joy. And again, sexual interest is noted. It all ends with the girl leaving the camera's field of view in the direction opposite to where her interlocutor was standing. The recording continues, and we see the elevator doors close and open twice. It is difficult to imagine that one can experience such emotions and perform such actions alone. As you know, mentally ill people, being in the grip of hallucinations, demonstrate specific motor skills. But nothing of the sort was observed in Eliza's behavior. Most likely, shortly before the described events, she met someone, perhaps even had a romantic relationship. On the video, the girl is playing hide-and-seek with her invisible companion. And although sometimes she shows some embarrassment, most likely, this is due to the fact that the acquaintance was short-lived, so Eliza felt a certain constraint and shyness. But definitely not fear. Almost throughout the entire recording, an element of play, flirting, sexual attraction is clearly visible in the girl's behavior, and only the realization that we are seeing her last minutes of life gives the video an eerie tinge. But in itself, this footage does not contain anything frightening. So, the conclusion suggests itself. There was someone else next to Eliza, someone who knew about the surveillance camera in the elevator and carefully avoided its gaze. Someone who knew that, by some strange coincidence, the video surveillance in the corridor of the 14th floor, which usually worked constantly, was turned off this time. So this someone could freely communicate with Eliza without fear of being noticed. What happened next? Let's turn to the plan of the 14th floor. On it we see A. Smokeless fire escapes, B. Internal fire escapes, one of which leads to the technical floor and the other to the roof. The doors to the internal stairs are locked with an electronic lock. It is impossible to open them unnoticed by the security. At that time, no attempts to pass through these doors were recorded. There remain the smokeless stairs mounted on the outer walls of the hotel. They can be used to reach the roof without much effort. This has been repeatedly proven by bloggers and journalists who penetrated there in this way. There were no obstacles to this. Only desire and a little courage were needed. If you perceive this as a romantic adventure, especially in the company of a person to whom you feel sympathy, then it can even be fun. It is quite possible that such a proposal caused Eliza the joy that can be noticed in several moments of the video recording. Most likely, the girl met her future killer even before February 1st, and it is just as likely that she voluntarily agreed to intimate closeness with him, as well as to climb to the roof together. Maybe she even undressed of her own free will. Until some fatal moment, Eliza's relationship with her killer was playful and quite friendly. And then some incident provoked an acute conflict. Murderers often commit crimes under the influence of aggression that arises in response to actions or words that are unacceptable to them. For serial killers, this is doubly true. They attack not every potential victim, but only the one whose behavior seems offensive to them. It seems that Eliza's killer did not torture or mock her. Most likely, he used a chokehold with his forearm, a technique from which even an adult man loses consciousness in just 15 seconds. This method has two important features. Firstly, it does not leave visible traces, and secondly, it leads to rapid loss of consciousness without the ability to resist. Having strangled Eliza, the criminal raised her unconscious body to the tank roof, using a ladder that was always stored there. This explains the absence of the girl's fingerprints on the stairs, and then, through the hatch, he lowered her into the water. Recall, Eliza was strangled, as indicated by pinpoint hemorrhages on the inner side of the eyelids and sclera found during the autopsy. At the same time, her mouth was not forcibly closed. Otherwise, there would have been injuries from the teeth on the inner side of the lips. No significant amount of water got into the lungs, which means there was no deep reflex inhalation underwater. Eliza ended up in the tank, either completely without breathing or with weakened superficial breathing. After that, the killer searched her clothes, taking the money, phone, and glasses. He had to get rid of the phone. It could have contained their correspondence and photos. He probably spent the money and kept the glasses as a trophy. Having searched the clothes, the criminal threw it into the same tank. He did not try to imitate suicide. He just hid the body. The person who killed Eliza Lamb is cold-blooded, prudent, and has experience in such matters. Perhaps she had already committed similar crimes before. The killer perfectly understood what the police would pay attention to and how he should act in order to remain unnoticed. It is possible that he knew. Water will destroy biological traces. If you look at the circumstances of Eliza Lamb's death without bias, it becomes obvious that this is not at all like suicide. Did the Los Angeles police investigators not understand this? No, they were perfectly aware of everything. It's just that the reason they decided not to open a criminal case was extremely pragmatic. After all, if there is a bullet, there must be a gun. If there is a stab wound, there must be a knife somewhere. This is how murders usually happen. But when there is something incomprehensible, vague, something that is difficult to prove, it is better to close the case at the stage of inquiry. Why waste effort and time on searches that may turn out to be in vain? Even if this murder was committed by a maniac, it is worth waiting for the next episode in order to understand the criminal's model of action. By the way, a similar crime occurred just a month later. In Los Angeles, even without Eliza Lamb, there are enough murdered women. Police resources should not be spent on an investigation that is minimally likely to end in a court verdict. Statistics require an increase in crime detection rates. Eliza Lamb's parents demanded compensation from the hotel for negligence. After all, unhindered access to the roof still exists. But negligence can be seen in this story literally in everything. Many questions remain for the investigation. Can we assert that everything happened exactly as described above? Of course not. This is just one version. Yes, there are huge databases that describe the typical behavior of murderers. They work well as an example. But can we say with certainty that the criminals who are caught are similar to those who are still at large? Perhaps the police catch those who have primitive motivation? What if they ended up behind bars precisely because of the predictability of their actions? It is quite probable that Eliza became the victim of someone whose actions cannot be explained. We can only hope that someday the truth will come out. The events of December 29, 2017, which took place in an apartment on McMillan Drive in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. The caller, a plumber named Sean Ferridan, made a chilling discovery: pieces of human flesh clogging the sewer pipes. Further investigation led law enforcement to the doorstep of 45-year-old Adam Strong, who lived in the apartment below. To everyone's great surprise, Strong immediately confessed that he was storing human remains in his freezer. But this was just the tip of the iceberg in this complex and horrifying story. The roots of this tragedy run much deeper and require careful examination to determine to whom these remains belonged and how they ended up in the bathroom sewer. The year 2017 brought a horrific crime to the city of Oshawa that shook the entire country. On September 11th, a disturbing discovery was made in Lake Ontario near the shore of Oshawa. A 5-year-old boy fishing with his grandfather spotted human torsos in the water. Law enforcement immediately arrived at the scene, retrieved the remains from the water, and launched an investigation. Despite extensive searches involving divers, no other body parts were found. The autopsies showed that the torsos belonged to a woman, but the exact cause of death could not be determined. However, the nature of the injuries indicated a violent death. The absence of the head made it extremely difficult to identify the victim, so DNA analysis was the only way. And only on November 9, 2017, 2 months after the terrible discovery, the bitter truth was revealed. The torsos belonged to 18-year-old Rory H., a pregnant Oshawa resident who had gone missing at the end of August of the same year. Rory H. was born on July 9, 1999, and was the favorite of her mother, Shannon Dion. Little is known about her father, but some of the girl's relatives had a reputation for living a reckless lifestyle. Her grandfather, Bernard, a former biker, gangster, and boxer, was widely known as the founder and leader of the motorcycle club Satan's Choice. Rory's uncle, Harley, also belonged to the motorcycle club Hell's Angels. But despite these family ties, Rory's childhood was fairly quiet. She was described as a kind and smart girl. In addition to her mother, Rory had a very close relationship with her godmother and Shannon's best friend, Christy Melnick. In the lower grades, Rory excelled in her studies, and at the age of 13, she even received the prestigious title of Cadet of the Year in the local unit. But everything changed for the worse in the first year of high school, when someone introduced her to drugs, which led to addiction. The next years of Rory's life were filled with turbulence, and drugs became an integral part of her existence. In an attempt to finance her addiction, she resorted to prostitution, causing even more suffering for her mother. Shannon, in desperation, turned to Child Protective Services for help, hoping to save her daughter. Fortunately, in early 2017, Shannon's efforts paid off. Rory finally began to take steps to change her life. She found a job, returned to school, and seemed to find stability by moving in with her boyfriend, Tony. Despite all the hardships, Rory was determined to start a new chapter in her life. In August 2017, Rory told her mother about her pregnancy. She firmly decided to have the baby, and Shannon supported her decision. But the mother had no idea that her daughter had started using drugs again. On August 28th, near the shopping center, Rory met with Constable Christopher Kane. He had been watching the girl for a long time and was trying in every way to involve social services to help her overcome her addiction. During the conversation, Rory admitted that she was using drugs again and was engaged in prostitution to get money for a fix. Concerned about Rory's fate, Constable Kane decided to contact the appropriate services, but when he returned, the girl had already disappeared. On August 29, 2017, the day after meeting with the constable, a friend of her mother brought Rory to the hospital after an exacerbation of a mental disorder. Unfortunately, for unknown reasons, they were unable to stay with her and left after a few minutes, leaving Rory alone. Remarkably, just 15 minutes later, she decided to leave the hospital without waiting for the necessary medical care. Surveillance cameras captured Rory calmly leaving the building. This was the last confirmation that the girl was still alive. From that moment on, nothing was known about her whereabouts. When Rory's relatives and friends did not receive any news from her for several days, they became alarmed. Fearing the worst, they filed a missing person report with the police, which launched a massive search. Flyers with the photo of the missing person were posted all over the area, but all efforts to find Rory H. proved futile, and only the results of the DNA test brought the horrible news, confirming that she had become a victim of a violent crime. However, the investigation did not end there. Law enforcement faced a difficult task to find the rest of her body parts and piece together all the fragments of this tragic puzzle. And it seemed that success was near, but it came so unexpectedly that it exceeded all expectations. 2 months after the gruesome torso discovery, residents of the upstairs apartment at 19 McMillan Drive experienced persistent sewage problems. The situation escalated to the point where the couple had to call a plumber on December 29th. Since no blockages were found in the upper apartment, the workers asked permission to enter the apartment of 45-year-old Adam Strong, located on the floor below. When the plumber started working in his toilet, the air filled with an unbearable stench, different from the usual smells. The situation further escalated when Adam's behavior became nervous. He constantly walked around the room, closely monitoring every move and asking many questions. Despite being annoyed by his behavior, the plumbers tried to ignore it. Strong justified himself by saying that he was just curious because he himself had tried to cope with the problem, but to no avail. Perhaps they would have completely ignored Adam if it were not for the shocking discovery inside the pipe. The workers pulled out a 45-centimeter piece of human flesh with attached hair. To their horror, stunned by the gruesome discovery, they immediately notified the police. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived at the scene and confirmed that what was found was indeed human remains. After gathering all the necessary information from the plumbers and the alarmed couple, the officers began a conversation with Adam Strong, preparing for unexpected revelations. But nothing could have prepared them for what the suspect told them. Lowering his head, he confessed that it was human flesh, and if they needed the rest of the body parts, they were in his freezer. Strong was instantly arrested, and the police began searching the apartment. What they saw resembled a house of horrors, dirt everywhere, and the air was permeated with an unbearable stench of decay. In the bathroom, it turned out that Adam had dismantled the toilet, trying to eliminate the blockage. But the real horror awaited law enforcement. In the bedroom in the freezer lay the remains of a young woman with her head hidden in a bag. The body was in a state of decomposition, as Strong had said. Among the remains, a tattoo with the inscription "Je vis I live" was found exactly the same as Rory H. had. Further DNA examination confirmed that the remains from Adam Strong's apartment belonged to the missing Rory. There was more than enough evidence of her presence there. The girl's blood was found on the walls and ceiling of Adam's bedroom, and his biological fluids were found on her underwear. Rory's sneakers lay wrapped in plastic, spattered with blood. Police also discovered an improvised dissection table set up by Strong. The realization that it was on this table that Adam dismembered his victim made law enforcement officers shudder. During the search of the apartment, numerous sex toys, restraints, and a homemade bomb were also found. Fortunately, the explosives were neutralized in time, and although no one could figure out its origin, due to the lack of direct evidence of Strong's involvement in Rory's murder, the police could not charge him. Instead, he was charged with abusing the body. It was time for the investigation to get to know the life of this 45-year-old man more closely. Adam Strong, about whom little was known, settled in a rented apartment on McMillan in early 2007. For many years, he worked as a security guard on a film set in Oshawa and as a gas station attendant at 2 different stations in Ajax. Those who knew Strong described him as an eccentric man with a sinister character who considered himself smarter than he actually was. He could talk incessantly, not knowing when to stop. One of Adam's ex-girlfriends, whose name has not been disclosed, described him as cruel and prone to excessive control. Adam's landlady, Eugenia Papadakis, also had unpleasant impressions from communicating with Strong. In March 2017, after a fire in the house, she and her granddaughter visited Adam's apartment on McMillan Drive. The dwelling turned out to be cluttered with garbage, food scraps, and all sorts of junk. Needless to say, what they saw stunned the women. In addition, Strong showed an unhealthy interest in pornography, which indicated his passion for explicit content. These observations allowed a deeper look into his psyche and shed light on the dark, disturbing world that reigned in the suspect's apartment. However, despite the tragic circumstances, the evidence gathered was still insufficient to charge him with murder. So the detectives focused on obtaining a confession from Adam Strong. The morning of December 30th, 2017 was marked by the interrogation of Adam Strong, conducted by detectives from the Homicide Investigation Unit, Darren Short and Herman Daroga. By that time, the suspect had already managed to contact his lawyer. The investigators realized that this was their only chance to get valuable testimony from him, because the next day, there was to be a hearing on the possibility of releasing Strong on bail. After that, it would be impossible to interrogate him without a court order. Time was running out, so the detectives had to get important information from Adam by any means necessary. Starting the interrogation, the investigators had no clear idea what to expect. Deep down, they hoped that Strong would be nervous, because he had finally been caught.
So Adam, my name is Detective Short.
Hello, Detective
My first name is Darren. This is Detective Durego. And what's your name?
Adam.
Last name?
Strong.
Strong, okay. As of right now, what I want to tell you is the charge you're going to be facing right now is indignity to a body.
Instead, they were faced with an imperturbable, collected man who showed outright indifference to his situation. But the biggest problem was getting him to talk about the events related to Rory Hatch. Adam's stubbornness was surprising, especially considering his previous confession about human remains in the freezer. Realizing that time was running out, the detectives decided to change tactics. They tried to touch Strong's emotions, hoping to awaken at least a drop of remorse or sympathy for the victim and her loved ones. However, all attempts by investigators to get the desired answers were shattered against a wall of evasions and changes of subject.
How did you know Rory?
I'm not saying anything, I'm sorry.
Did you kill Rory?
Sorry, I'm not saying anything.
Adam's responses were shocking, but the only thing that seemed to affect him were photos of Rory, which he refused to look at. It was obvious that the suspect could no longer bear her gaze, and although the evidence gathered was quite enough to prove Rory Hatch's presence in Adam's apartment, the ultimate goal of the detectives was to
Uncover the truth about what happened and what led to the girl's tragic death. Unfortunately, Strong proved to be a tough nut to crack. No answers to questions about Rory. 2 hours later, it became obvious that the interrogation had reached a dead end. Adam's refusal to provide anything substantial raised more questions than answers. Having failed to succeed, the investigators reluctantly decided to stop the interrogation. What exactly brought Rory Hatch and Adam Strong together remained a mystery. Fortunately for the detectives, the suspect was not released on bail, so he remained in custody. Meanwhile, Oshawa police continued to search Adam's house, hoping to stumble upon new evidence and clues. The coroner's report on Rory's autopsy shed some light on the circumstances. It turned out that the girl's body had numerous injuries, including skull fractures. However, the forensic expert could not say with certainty whether these injuries were inflicted before or after her death. In addition, traces of drugs were found in the victim's body, and signs of the use of a restraining device were found on the body. Among the findings in Strong's house, the detective's attention was drawn to a bent hammer on which Rory's DNA was found. Investigators suggested that it was the murder weapon. However, even this was not the most shocking discovery, even when it seemed that nothing more would be found. In July 2018, 7 months after Adam's arrest, a hunting knife covered in human tissue was found in a kitchen drawer. Examination showed that the DNA found on the blade did not belong to Rory. Instead, it matched the genetic profile of another girl, Candace Fitzpatrick. Candace was born on February 3, 1989, and little is known about her childhood. The girl's parents, William Fitzpatrick, and a woman whose name has not been disclosed, divorced. After that, William moved to Alberta, and Candace stayed with her mother in Oshawa. Her life was chaotic and disorderly. At some point, she ran away from home, forcing her father to go looking for her in Oshawa. After reuniting, Candace declared her desire to live independently. And by the age of 19 in 2008, her life had turned into complete disorder. Like Rory, Candace was a troubled girl who struggled with drug addiction and engaged in prostitution to get money for her next fix. She could disappear from home for days or weeks at a time, but always returned. Until March 2008, from then on, her relatives never saw her alive again. William, growing increasingly worried about his daughter, launched a massive search throughout Oshawa. Oddly enough, an official missing person report for Candace was only filed with the police in 2010, 2 years after her disappearance. William reported that back in 2008, he had repeatedly contacted law enforcement, but they did not take the case seriously due to the peculiarities of Candace's lifestyle. 10 long years of painful uncertainty passed before the Fitzpatrick family finally learned the terrible truth they had long feared. The shocking coincidences between the fates of Candace and Rory were not limited to difficult life circumstances alone. Even outwardly, the girls were strikingly similar. The cruel irony of fate is that despite the 10-year difference in their disappearances, both died at the hands of the same person. It is unbearable to realize that if Adam had been exposed after Candace's murder, Rory could have been alive. The remains of Candace Fitzpatrick still have not been found, and the solution to this chilling mystery is known only to one person. Investigators managed to convince the prosecutor to drop the initial charge against Adam Strong and reclassify it as a charge of first-degree murder of Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick. This gave detectives the opportunity to interrogate the suspect again. Realizing the importance and complexity of the case, the Oshawa police leadership involved Detective Paul Mitten in the investigation, a highly qualified and experienced investigator, known for his ability to unravel the most complicated crimes. On November 18, 2018, 11 months after the first interrogation, Adam Strong again found himself face-to-face with the investigation. This interrogation was to be decisive. To the surprise of Detective Paul Mitten, the suspect suddenly began voluntarily sharing information.
Adam!
How you doing?
Good, you?
Had better days. I understand I'm in a lot of trouble. Is there any way I can get a cigarette?
What are you going to hankering for?
Wendy's triple?
Yeah, that's doable.
No pickles? Iced tea, no ice? Two, their value, spicy chicken wraps, and a grilled chicken Caesar salad.
Okay.
Is that outrageous?
No, that's doable.
I don't know how appropriate this is, but I'd like you to pass on to her mother and her father my condolences. I would like to, and I've fielded this to my lawyer, and he's not interested in it, and I don't understand why, of spilling the beans and being as comfortable as I can in jail. Not like $100,000 like Picton, but like an allowance. I don't know. I don't know. Like internet access. Like I don't have anybody who's gonna buy me a TV. She's definitely deceased.
Yes.
Yes.
And you clearly have said, I disposed of her.
Yes.
Yes.
Tried to. But unfortunately was foiled by inadequate plumbing.
Yep.
And that's a freaking shame. Not for me. For me.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah.
You sound really selfish when you say that.
Sorry. I don't expect to get out of the jail free card. I don't. I just want to be comfortable in jail, man.
Okay.
I didn't feel it. I'm really sorry.
Obviously, hours leading into a couple of days, I would imagine.
No, it was all done in one evening.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Like this was all one piece, and then this was all one piece.
I couldn't. Yeah.
Really?
Sorry, man. I don't remember.
Really?
Yeah, it wasn't important to me, man.
I hope one day the light bulb goes off for you. Not that you're finding remorse, but just for you to realize you could help some people feel better.
Yeah.
Adam was convinced that their conversation would be limited exclusively to the topic of dismemberment of bodies. He did not even suspect that his own careless confessions and slips of the tongue would allow investigators to draw key conclusions about the entire chronology of events related to the horrific crimes. The interrogation lasted 10 grueling hours and ended only when Detective Mitten felt he had obtained all the necessary testimony.
Is it safe to assume as an investigator that Candace's
I can't go into
proposal
that.
was similar?
I can't go into that.
How did you meet Candace?
You know what? So long ago, I have no idea.
Do you remember you met her like more than once, or was it just one time you met her?
Sorry, because every time she came to my house, she left my house. Under her own power.
Candace, given the fact that we're gonna assume because of tissue found on that knife, the gutting knife, that came back as Candace's. Why not use that on Rory?
Didn't even think of it.
Because her DNA wasn't found.
Didn't even think of it. I'm a real bad procrastinator, and that is really a detriment to myself.
On September 28, 2020, when 12 years had passed since Candace's disappearance and 3 years since Rora's disappearance, Adam Strong appeared in court on charges of these murders. Despite numerous evidence gathered against him, he refused to plead guilty to both counts. During the trial, the prosecution presented a powerful evidence base, including stunning records of interrogations that supported their case against Adam Strong. Testimony from Petra Danchin about the violence she suffered at the hands of the defendant further strengthened the weight of the accusations. Although Adam never revealed the details of Rora's death during interrogations, prosecutors built their case based on the available facts. According to their version, Strong lured the girl to his house by promising money for intimate services. As soon as she entered, he tied her up and brutally beat her with a hammer found in his home. Horribly, at that moment there was no one on the upper floor, so no one heard the desperate cries for help. After the murder, Adam dismembered Rora's lifeless body and threw the torso into Oshawa Harbor. Geolocation data from her mobile phone confirmed that on September 4th, a week before the discovery of human remains, Strong was in that area, which only strengthened the evidence against him. Prosecutors also expressed confidence that Candace suffered the same fate at the hands of the killer, although her remains had not been found at that time. Lawyers, however, insisted on Adam's non-involvement in Rora's death, claiming that death occurred as a result of a drug overdose, and their client was only trying to get rid of the body. As for Candace, the defense claimed that there was a lack of evidence that she had died in Strong's house at all. They also emphasized the limited size of the freezer, which could hardly hold the remains of 2 victims. However, having carefully examined all the evidence presented, Judge Joseph DeLuca came to the unshakable conviction of Adam Strong's guilt. He rejected the defense's arguments and found the prosecution's evidence convincing and incriminating. Strong tried to justify his actions with the traumatic experience of his childhood. According to him, at an early age, he was subjected to a brutal attack that left an indelible imprint on his psyche. Adam even expressed sympathy for the families of the deceased, but the sincerity of these words was highly doubtful. His behavior demonstrated an alarming level of indifference, lack of remorse, and signs of a split personality. The materials presented during the trial vividly demonstrated that Adam Strong was well aware of the severity of his actions and their consequences. He acted consciously and prudently, without feeling any remorse. In fact, the defendant viewed prison as a way to escape from life's troubles. In the face of unemployment and financial hardship, he was ready to exchange his freedom for the basic benefits that imprisonment could guarantee. The court found that Rory Hatch's death occurred as a result of an attack, so Adam Strong was found guilty of first-degree murder. As for Candace Fitzpatrick, his guilt was classified as manslaughter. In May 2021, Strong was sentenced to life imprisonment. In addition, for the murder of Candace, he received an additional 80-year term, which is to be served concurrently with life imprisonment. This is the maximum punishment provided for by the country's legislation. Although nothing could bring back the dead girls, Rory and Candace relatives felt that justice had finally prevailed. In July 2021, Strong provided valuable information about the location of Candace Fitzpatrick's remains. Thanks to his testimony, on November 4th of the same year, the police found the place where, according to the criminal, he had buried the girl's body. On November 8th, law enforcement officers finally managed to find human remains. After conducting the necessary examinations, on November 13th, they were officially identified as the remains of Candace. The final identification results were announced at a press conference on February 16, 2022. What exactly made Adam Strong change his behavior and start talking remains a mystery. Some suggest that he sought notoriety through his actions. However, despite the tragic circumstances that united their fates, the families of Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick continue to support each other, and together overcome the painful consequences of the horror they experienced. The cases of the murders of these girls have been solved. The victim's family was unspeakably happy after the announcement of the verdict for their daughter's killer, because they understood that he would never leave prison alive. But the investigation suspects that Adam Strong may be involved in other murders as well. In June 2022, during a search of his apartment, the police seized some physical evidence. However, the details of this finding are being kept secret while additional investigations are ongoing. Let's consider the main reasons that led to this tragedy. 1. Drug addiction. Both victims, Rory and Candace, struggled with drug addiction. This made them vulnerable and forced them to engage in risky behavior such as prostitution to finance their addiction. 2. Social isolation. Although both girls had families who cared about them, their lifestyle often led to isolation from loved ones and support. 3. Insufficient attention from law enforcement. In the case of Candace Fitzpatrick, her father's initial reports of her disappearance were not taken seriously due to her lifestyle. Now, I would like to share some important tips on how to avoid similar situations in the future. 1. Fight drug addiction. If you or someone you love is suffering from drug addiction, seek professional help immediately. There are many rehabilitation and support programs that can help overcome addiction. 2. Stay in touch with loved ones. Communicate regularly with family and friends. If you notice that someone close to you is distancing themselves or behaving unusually, don't ignore it. Offer your support and assistance. 3. Be vigilant. If you notice something suspicious in your surroundings, unusual smells, strange behavior of neighbors, don't be shy to report it to the appropriate authorities. Your vigilance can save someone's life. 4. Take disappearances seriously. If someone you know has gone missing, report it to the police immediately. Don't wait, hoping that the person will return on their own. Every hour can be crucial. 5. Teach children about safety. Talk to children about personal safety. Teach them to recognize potentially dangerous situations and people. Explain how important it is to trust their intuition and not be ashamed to ask for help. 6. Don't judge, but help. Instead of judging people for their lifestyle, try to understand their problems and offer help. Often people find themselves in difficult situations due to circumstances they cannot control. This tragic story of Rory Heche and Candace Fitzpatrick demonstrates to us how important it is to be vigilant and caring members of society. We all have a responsibility for the safety of our community. It is important to remember that criminals like Adam Strong often look for vulnerable victims. They may seem like ordinary people, but behind this mask lie dangerous intentions. Therefore, it is critically important to learn to recognize alarming signs and not ignore them. This case also highlights the need to reform the system for responding to missing persons. Regardless of the lifestyle of the missing person, every case must be investigated with the same seriousness and thoroughness. Perhaps if the police had responded more quickly to Candace's disappearance, the tragedy with Rory could have been prevented. Remember that safety is a shared responsibility. Each of us can contribute to creating a safer society. Be attentive to your surroundings, support those who need it, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you feel that something is wrong. Christine Johnson, like many little girls, dreamed of a Hollywood star's life from childhood being beautiful, wealthy, and famous. She grew up in a loving family, had a happy childhood, and ambitious plans for the future. Christine's desire to become famous came true, but unfortunately, not due to her talents, but because of the cruelty of her killer, and the details will shock you because her body was found with a torn-off ear. Born in 1981 in Santa Clara, California, Christine soon moved with her parents, Teresa and Kirk Johnson, to the small town of Saugatuck in Michigan. It was a cozy and picturesque place with a population of less than 1,000 people, where an atmosphere of peace and security prevailed. Crime here was extremely low, so locals didn't even lock their doors, not fearing criminals. Everyone in the community knew each other. Christine grew up along with her brother Derek, who was a few years older, in a family that seemed friendly and happy at first glance. However, the family idyll was shattered when the parents decided to divorce. Despite this, they maintained a good relationship for the sake of the children. According to the custody plan, Christine and Derek alternately lived with their mom and dad. Due to such circumstances, the girl got involved in household chores early and started helping her mother at the age of 12, including with the family budget. Striving for financial independence, Christine tried to get any job so as not to ask her parents for money. Meanwhile, her brother went to serve in the army and then decided to become a career military man. While studying in high school, Christine, having become independent, took her life into her own hands. Intelligence and natural beauty helped her in this. The girl was cheerful, fun, and an interesting conversationalist. She looked great thanks to an active and healthy lifestyle. Relatives, admiring Christine's beauty, advised her to conquer Hollywood. The girl got the most pleasure from sailing, surfing, and other water activities that she enjoyed when visiting her grandmother in California. However, after returning to Michigan, Christine missed her favorite hobbies and needed time to adjust to a different way of life. Here she became passionate about theater, being a member of a small acting group. In winter, she worked part-time as a waitress in a local cafe. Thanks to her friendliness, politeness, and sociability, Christine became a real find for the owner of the establishment, attracting more and more visitors. Christine increasingly thought about leaving the small town of Saugatuck. The measured life of the province did not appeal to her. The girl was convinced that she deserved something more than just serving food in a cafe. Christine saw no serious prospects for herself in this town. after graduating from high school in 1999, she finally gained enough freedom to start building her own life and path to success. Having thought over her situation, Christine decided to go in search of herself. The girl traveled to different cities, worked there, and tried her hand at various fields of activity. Eventually, in 2000, she chose California, which she loved so much, as her place of residence. This state attracted her with its wonderful climate and much wider opportunities for realizing her potential. At first, Christine moved in with her grandmother, who lived in the small resort town of Santa Maria with a population of 100,000 people. Despite being close to her favorite entertainment, the girl first focused on solving important issues. First of all, she started looking for a job, because providing for herself was very important to her. Christine got a job as a system administrator in the city's electric power company. Then she focused on her education and decided to enter the University of California. The educational institution was located a 40-minute drive from her grandmother's house. Christine successfully passed the entrance tests and bought a car with the money she had earned earlier. However, even with her own transport, daily trips over such long distances took too much of her time. Therefore, the girl began to look for a job closer to the university. This is how Christine first touched her dream Hollywood. She managed to get a part-time job with a film crew that was planning to shoot a movie. The experience of performing in a theater group helped the girl quickly adapt to the new working atmosphere. Eventually, she was hired as an assistant on the set of a thriller. Here, Christine met people who lived and breathed Hollywood. For a girl from the province, it was a real starry moment. She communicated with world-famous actors and directors and felt incredible happiness. Christine could not believe that she had the opportunity to interact with celebrities. The world of cinema completely captivated her. This work inspired young Christine so much that she wanted to be even closer to the film industry. The girl enrolled in professional makeup courses taught by Hollywood makeup artists. Having mastered these skills, she thought about becoming a makeup artist on a film set. For this, Christine was going to go to the city of her dreams, Los Angeles. Although it was quite a risky journey, curiosity overcame the fear of the unknown. The girl was irresistibly drawn to Hollywood. Eventually, Christine moved to Los Angeles, a city where several famous film studios are located at once. For a young and attractive girl, it was a real period of trials and temptations, but she demonstrated the best manners and decency that only a young lady is capable of. Despite the popular trends in the environment she found herself in, Christine did not lead a dissolute lifestyle. The girl avoided noisy parties and get-togethers, remaining a rather modest person. She had a relationship with a guy she had met a few years ago and continued to communicate with, overcoming the distance between them. Later, he moved to Christine, and starting from 2002, the young people decided to rent an apartment in Los Angeles together. Since they had not yet achieved financial stability, such a step was beneficial for both of them. It was a difficult adventure, but Christine did not lose heart and began to look for a new job on a permanent basis. However, difficulties arose with this. The girl managed to find only temporary part-time jobs, and there was no serious work. The lion's share of their joint budget was earned by her boyfriend. Meanwhile, relations between Christine and Todd became more and more tense. Later, the girl complained to her mother that verbal altercations with her beloved increasingly turned into physical violence on his part. She found herself trapped in a toxic relationship, complicated by financial hardship. Christine's mother began to look for new housing for her daughter so that she could move away from her problematic partner. Eventually, Christine broke up with her boyfriend and settled in a small apartment. She continued to get an education remotely. During this period, her father provided the girl with substantial financial support. He believed that his daughter would finally find her place in life and realize her calling, so he sought to help her in every possible way. By November 2002, Christine finally managed to get a job at a mobile communications company, but this position was far from her ideals. Neither the field of activity nor the level of income met the girl's expectations. In addition, Christine still could not find acceptable housing near her place of work. Instead, her mother found a cozy house in the town of Santa Monica, neighboring Los Angeles, which had to be shared with 2 more girls. The attractive thing was that it was located next to the beach in a lively residential area. It seemed like an ideal place to get on her feet, so Christine moved there. During this period, the girl transferred to the University of Santa Monica. Christine's dreams of Hollywood did not come true. She failed to start a career, her relationship with her beloved fell apart, and she was actually forced to start her life from scratch. However, the girl did not lose heart and continued to steadily go towards her dream. On February 15, 2003, Christine planned to attend a party. Before that, the young beauty visited a shopping center. She had a long, fun conversation with her mother, during which they discussed the girl's plans for the future. This call was Christine's last contact with her loved ones. The next day, on Sunday, February 16, 2003, the mother was eagerly waiting for a call from her daughter, hoping to hear about how the previous day had gone. However, the girl never got in touch. The worried woman tried to call Christine herself, but her phone was unavailable. At first, this did not cause serious concern, because the daughter could be resting or at work and not hear the call. However, the next day there was still no news from Christine. Around 9 in the morning, the alarmed mother called her daughter's work. Christine was always in touch and answered calls, but this time an answering machine worked instead of her. Then the woman contacted the girl's manager, who informed her that she had not shown up for work. He emphasized that Christine was a very responsible employee, and during the last 3 months she had no delays or absenteeism. The girl's absence surprised all her colleagues, but they also could not reach her. As the manager said, Christine was last seen at work on February 14th. One of her co-workers recalled that the girl was going to some party. The mother of the missing girl visited her daughter's page on social networks, hoping to find useful information about this event. But in vain, Christine had not published a single photo. Although previously she actively maintained her profile, actually documenting every step of her life. The woman also checked her daughter's bank accounts, but no transactions had been made since her disappearance. In search of her daughter, the mother called all the hospitals, but Christine was not registered anywhere. So on February 17th, she decided to contact the Santa Monica Police Department with a statement about the disappearance of her 21-year-old daughter. The investigators checked whether a girl matching the description had been involved in traffic accidents during these days, but found nothing. The missing beauty's neighbors also heard nothing about her since her disappearance. The police turned to Christine's ex-boyfriend, Todd, with whom she had a rather stormy and sometimes violent relationship. The version was considered that he could have found his beloved who had run away from him and done something to her, but the young man denied seeing the girl. Christine's neighbors were only able to provide superficial information about the last day they saw the girl. According to them, on Saturday, February 15th, the missing girl was going to some party, but with whom and where exactly they did not know. The same information came from the girl's colleagues when they communicated with her mother. This clue became the first in the investigation, so the detectives began to carefully check it. Later, another detective joined the case. While reviewing the collected materials, he was struck by the photo of the missing girl. The crime victim bore a striking resemblance to another girl who had disappeared earlier and was found dead in 1995. That girl, starting her modeling career, agreed to a photo shoot for the glossy magazine Photographer, but these plans were not destined to come true. It was about Linde Sobek, killed by photographer Charles Redburn. He lured the beautiful blonde out of town by deception, where he dishonored and took her life. The policeman knew that at the time of Christine's disappearance, Linde's killer was already serving a sentence in prison, so physically he could not be involved in the new crime. However, it could be a follower of Charles, who was inspired by his scheme of action. Detectives needed at least some clue related to the missing girl, so they put out an alert for her car, a white Mazda Mitre. At the same time, while communicating with Christine's mother, investigators found out more details about the girl's ex-boyfriend Todd, and also learned the name of her new chosen one, Lucas. However, the woman knew very little about the latter. She could not even name his last name, which greatly complicated the search. More than 48 hours had passed since Christine's disappearance, a critical period in such cases. The police seriously considered the possibility that the girl might already be dead. They began to analyze the billing data of her mobile phone. It turned out that the last outgoing call was made on February 15th at 17:34. Christine called the directory service at 411, which could indicate that she was in trouble and was trying to clarify an address or someone's phone number. The conversation lasted about 3 minutes, so this communication could be of great importance for the investigation. Unfortunately, it was not possible to find out the exact content of the dialogue, since such calls were not recorded. After that conversation, the girl's mobile phone was discharged. The last location of the gadget, recorded by the system, indicated the area of Ventura Boulevard. The police decided to involve the media in the investigation. The headlines immediately featured messages about Christine's disappearance with hints of the similarity of this case to Linde's murder. In search of clues, investigators carefully searched the apartment where Christine lived. Among the finds was a receipt from a lingerie store, dated the day the girl disappeared, February 15th. The police managed to find out that, despite the aggressive behavior of her ex-boyfriend, Christine continued to maintain contact with him. Sometimes she visited him, the last time on February 7th, but the detectives managed to find the most serious clue while studying the missing girl's email. On February 13th, Christine sent a message to the party coordinator, in which she expressed a passionate anticipation of the holiday and her intention to buy a ticket. In response, she was informed about the complete sale of tickets, but assured that she would be included in a separate waiting list. This is a fairly common practice among organizers of events. With the participation of celebrities in this way, they encourage visitors to buy VIP tickets at greatly inflated prices. Finally, the police managed to find Christine's new boyfriend, Lucas, and talk to him. According to the young man, he last saw the girl on February 14th, the day before her disappearance. They watched a movie together, after which they parted. Lucas successfully passed a polygraph test, had a reliable alibi, and did not arouse any suspicion among the investigators. Later, the detectives interrogated Christine's ex-boyfriend Todd, but he also had an alibi, confirmed by several witnesses. It turned out that at the time of the girl's disappearance, Todd was out of town. Among all the versions, the police were most interested in the one that was associated with the party where Christine was heading and from where she never returned. Investigators were convinced that the key to unraveling the girl's disappearance lies here. They contacted the organizers of the event and were shocked by what they heard. It turns out that Christine never bought a ticket and did not show up at the party. But where did the girl go then? To restore the chronology of events on the fateful evening, the police tracked transactions from the missing girl's bank card. This helped to establish all the stores that Christine visited that day. Law enforcement officers carefully reviewed the recordings from video surveillance cameras in these establishments, hoping to identify something extraordinary or stumble upon clues. But this painstaking work took a lot of time. In parallel with the analysis of these data, the police received an alarming call. A woman named Susan Murphy reported a suspicious guy she met at a store. He introduced himself as Victor Thomas, an employee of a film company that conducts casting for a new James Bond movie. The man began to put psychological pressure on Susan, inviting her to the role of Bond's girl and admiring her beauty. He persistently inclined the woman to participate in the casting, but this seemed extremely suspicious to her. Susan barely managed to refuse at the last moment. Fortunately, she went to meet with the stranger accompanied by her husband, a former police officer. Susan's husband personally spoke with Victor, trying to inquire about his true intentions, but the suspect suddenly fled without providing any useful information. Later, Susan decided to check all the data she knew about Victor and found out that he was lying. Victor Thomas had nothing to do with the film industry. Moreover, a person with that name did not exist at all. It seems that the man invented a legend, similar to Linde Sabik's killer, in order to meet a beautiful woman. But for what purpose remained a mystery. Although Susan's story ended well, Victor was still at large and could continue his shenanigans. Therefore, the police urgently began to check the received information and search for the suspicious guy. It was quite possible that he had evil intentions. Investigators studied the recordings from surveillance cameras of all the stores where Christine made purchases on the eve of her disappearance, but found nothing worthy of attention. Then they decided to go around the shops and interview the staff. The salespeople were shown a sketch of Victor, who allegedly harassed beautiful girls. In one of the stores, the cashier recalled seeing a similar man, but could not provide any more details. Eventually, an artist arrived on the scene to compile a sketch of the suspect. The search for Christine was gaining momentum. Dog handlers with dogs and volunteers were sent to the area from where the girl last got in touch and called the directory service. Patrols and volunteers continued to look for the missing girl's car and Christine herself. There were many messages from citizens that a similar car was seen in different places, but all these clues turned out to be false. Finally, on February 24th, an important signal was received by the police. In the parking lot of the shopping center that Christine visited on the day of her disappearance, her car was found a white Mazda Miata. The forensic expert who arrived at the scene conducted a thorough inspection of the interior, seized fingerprints and all potential evidence. A bottle of water was found on the back seat, and the missing girl's mobile phone was on the front seat. But the investigators were most surprised by the story of the parking lot guide. The man recalled a strange incident related to this car. The car drove into the spot at 17:45, although it was reserved for another client. Some man got out of the car who, upon hearing the guard's remark, behaved extremely aggressively. The stranger threw the car keys at the guard and left without any explanation. There was no one in the cabin at that time. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in the parking lot, so it was not possible to see the driver. Having no clues, the detectives decided to return to the analysis of Christine's purchases on the day of her disappearance. What they found shocked the investigators. On the eve of her disappearance, the girl bought clothes that exactly matched the description provided by Susan. When inviting the woman to the casting, Victor asked her to wear an extremely short black mini-skirt, a white blouse, stockings and shoes. It was these very items that were paid for with Christine's credit card. The police ruled out the possibility of a simple coincidence. It seemed that the girl had fallen for the bait of a fraudster whose true motives remained a mystery. Christine repeated Susan's fate. Only the latter was lucky to have an escort in the form of her husband. Unfortunately, no information about the mysterious Victor could be found, and law enforcement officers were at an impasse. They turned to Christine's roommates again. The girls recalled that the missing woman was indeed going to some kind of casting, but they could not provide any details. During the conversation, they managed to remember that the audition was definitely related to a James Bond movie. According to them, Christine was extremely excited on the eve of the event. The description of her outfit, a blouse and a mini-skirt in which she left the house, completely coincided with the officers' fears. Christine was very afraid of being late for the casting scheduled for 17:30. She was wearing the exact revealing clothes that the villain had asked Susan to wear, and possibly Christine herself. Detectives continued to review the surveillance camera footage over and over again, hoping to find Victor. Eventually, they managed to spot the right man in the store where the employees mentioned him. However, the video quality was so low that it was impossible to make out facial features. Still, it was at least some kind of lead. Using eyewitness testimony, investigators were able to compile an approximate portrait of the suspect. By February 26th, a sketch of the main suspect in the disappearance of the young beauty was created. One of the experienced detectives, having familiarized himself with the case materials, recognized Victor Paleologus in it, who had been released on parole very recently, on January 20th, 23. In the past, the man had already been convicted of a sexual crime. Among the episodes of his rich criminal past, there was a case when he lured a woman named Christine Kludgian to his apartment in a similar manner. After inviting her to a supposedly noisy party with celebrities, Victor met the victim in an empty, quiet house. There he began to harass the guest, and when she resisted, he attacked her. The attacker used a rope, strangled Christine with it, and then tried to tie the woman up for violence. But the victim had enough strength to break free, run out of the apartment and call the neighbors for help. Victor Paleologus used the same scheme, luring victims with promises of casting or invitations to parties. This technique worked flawlessly, especially near the Walk of Fame. Many girls came to Los Angeles in search of fulfilling their Hollywood dream, and villains like Victor took advantage of this. For the first attack on a girl, Paleologus got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, there was an attempt to dishonor Katie DeBiono in 1998. Then he called himself Brian, a movie producer. For this crime, he was punished with a minimum term. There was reason to believe that Victor was also involved in embezzlement of funds in the company where he previously worked. In addition, the police identified many other victims, women whom Paleologus tried to use. However, all the statements of the victims were ignored by law enforcement officers due to lack of evidence. Once Victor broke into the house of his ex-girlfriend. Although he did not manage to bring his criminal intent to the end, the man still stole money and jewelry from the home. And even for this act, he got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, an even more serious case occurred. Victor lured a girl named Heather into a trap. As always, he incited her to dress in a seductive manner. It seems that this particular appearance of the victim excited him the most. Then Paleologus tried to tie the girl up in order to get intimate, but Heather miraculously managed to break free. Somehow she managed to push the attacker away with the sharp heel of her shoe. These precious seconds allowed her to run out of the trap and hide in her own car. The girl filed a statement against the offender. For this crime, Victor received 2 years in prison, but was released on parole on January 20th, 2003. This happened just 3 weeks before Christine's disappearance. It seems that once at liberty, the repeat offender took up the old. By the time the police got on the trail of Paleologus, he had already been arrested. This time he stole a BMW X5 in Beverly Hills and tried to sell the car with forged documents. The detainee was found to have a wallet with a whole bunch of stolen IDs, credit cards, and other documents. Victor perfectly matched the type of criminal involved in Christine's disappearance. His handwriting completely coincided with what was known to the investigation. All the facts pointed to Paleologus, so the detectives decided to show his photo to Susan, who avoided the attack thanks to the intervention of her husband. At the police station, Susan unhesitatingly pointed to Victor's photograph among other pictures. Later, during the identification procedure, she again unmistakably identified him, noting that she immediately recognized the man, despite obvious attempts to change his appearance. Paleologus slouched a little, extended one arm, making it longer than the other, and combed his hair in a new way. But all these tricks did not help him avoid exposure. During a separate check, Susan's husband, who once tried to detain the criminal, also recognized him. Unfortunately, the parking lot guard where the missing girl's car was found could not identify the suspect. He only managed to see Victor for a moment from afar and in the dark, without seeing his face. At the time the photo was presented, Paleologus was already behind bars, although on the day of Christine's disappearance he was still at large. During the interrogation, the suspect denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance and flatly refused to admit the fact of communicating with Susan, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence to the contrary. Victor refused to testify without a lawyer, explaining this by his recent parole and fears that he was being framed. So the detectives continued to collect evidence against him. Soon a new witness came forward, a realtor who had been working with Victor for the last few weeks and noticed some oddities in his behavior. Paleologus was looking through a real estate agent for a house worth up to $700,000. They inspected several properties every day when suddenly a message came about the disappearance of documents and keys from one of the houses. Then the realtor did not even suspect that his client could be involved in this. But as soon as he saw Victor's photo in the news summary, everything fell into place. The witness also identified the suspect. According to him, their last meeting took place just a day before Christine's disappearance. Then Victor behaved strangely. He was somewhat nervous. In one of the inspected houses, he went to the toilet and began to shout loudly from there, allegedly checking the quality of sound insulation. The police suggested that this way the man could look for a place for his criminal actions, where the screams of the victims would remain unheard. Detectives examined all the houses that Paleologus visited. They paid special attention to the object that so intrigued the suspect. Interestingly, this dwelling was located in the same area where Christine's mobile phone signal was last recorded. Investigators literally turned the house upside down, looking for at least some evidence of Victor's involvement in the girl's disappearance or her possible body, but found nothing. Meanwhile, searches continued in Paleologus' apartment. Photos of women in clothes that the suspect seemed to especially like were found on his computer. A short skirt, a white blouse, stockings, and high-heeled shoes. It had been 12 days since the start of the investigation, but the missing girl's family still cherished the hope of Christine returning home alive. Victor continued to deny everything and was in no hurry to share any information with the police. He only confirmed the fact of meeting the girl, after which, according to him, they went their separate ways and he did not see her again. Victor Paleologus was born in 1962 in Pennsylvania into an ordinary family. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. The man graduated from college with a bachelor's degree, after which he entered graduate school in Los Angeles. From 1990 to 1993, he was married. Interestingly, some facts indicated that in 1991 Victor could have tried to poison his wife when she filed a statement against him. All of Paleologus' attempts to organize his own restaurant business failed. It seemed that this was a world-weary loser who had slipped into a life of crime. It seems that Victor's fetish for beautiful women forced him to cross a dangerous line, and he began to attack them for the purpose of intimacy and sexual gratification. Regarding the evening of Christine's disappearance, Paleologus, together with his lawyer, provided an alibi. Allegedly, Victor had dinner with an acquaintance in a restaurant. This information was indeed confirmed, but law enforcement officers understood that despite this, the man still had enough time to play out another criminal drama and kidnap a new victim. On March 1st, another witness called the police. According to his statement, on February 15th, he saw the missing girl. She stopped near his house in search of some mansion that resembled a castle. The man could not help her because he himself did not know where this building was located. Instead, his wife, hearing their conversation, told Christine the direction. The incident occurred around 1730. Now it became clear for what purpose the girl dialed the number of the directory service 411. She needed navigation to a building that looked like a castle. Investigators had a new lead. Moreover, it was in such a house that Victor checked the quality of sound insulation. Everything pointed to him. While the detectives were working with this data, a new event occurred. On March 3, 2003, 4 teenage friends were walking through the Hollywood Hills, admiring the picturesque panorama of Los Angeles. Suddenly, one of the guys, approaching the edge of a cliff, noticed some strange object below, 100 meters from him. At first, the young men thought it was a mannequin. They tried to go down to take a closer look at the find, but could not overcome the entire distance. However, this was enough to understand that it was a human body. The frightened guys for a long time could not decide what to do next, because none of them took a mobile phone with them. Eventually, they went to the police station. On the way, the teenagers met a woman who was walking dogs and told her about the horrendous find. She approached the body to make sure the guys were not mistaken. The victim was wearing a grey hooded sweatshirt. Her legs were tied and wrapped in blue fabric. The hands of the deceased were behind her back, and a hairband was on her right wrist. Below the waist, tattered stockings were visible. Frightened by what she saw, the woman called the police. Soon, law enforcement officers and rescuers arrived at the scene. They had to sweat a lot to get the mutilated body from the hard-to-reach area. Obviously, the criminal hoped that his victim would never be found here. Perhaps this would have happened if it were not for the quick-witted teenagers who accidentally wandered into this deserted area. The forensic expert identified the deceased as the missing Christine Johnson. Her body was found not far from the house that Victor liked so much during the real estate viewing with the realtor. The girl's parents were immediately informed about the tragic news, who could not believe the reality of what had happened and did not hold back their despair over the loss of their daughter. Christine's entire body was covered with bruises and scratches, indicating desperate attempts to resist. The corpse was in a terrible condition and had time to undergo significant putrefactive changes, lying under the scorching sun for more than 1 day. In addition, it rained 1 day. The face was especially disfigured, which was facilitated by both numerous injuries and the unnatural position of the deceased's body with her head lowered. Someone tore off the girl's ear. The expert also noted large bruises on Christine's head and neck, which indicated a traumatic brain injury and strangulation. Initially, this was recognized as the cause of death, but soon even more horrific details were clarified. Investigators had no doubt that it was Victor Paleologos who was involved in the murder of Christine Johnson. However, it was necessary to prove that at the time of the girl's death, the suspect did not have an alibi. For this purpose, the detectives went to Joey, an acquaintance with whom Victor allegedly had dinner that fatal evening. But it turned out that in fact it was not a friend, but a casual acquaintance. During a thorough interrogation, the man admitted that he and Victor had agreed to meet much later than the incident with Christine occurred. According to Joey, they met Paleologos only the day before. On February 15th, Victor was late for the meeting, arriving around midnight, although they initially planned to meet much earlier. The suspect's face had fresh scratches, which he explained as an accidental injury during the move. The police step-by-step recreated the probable sequence of events that preceded the disappearance of Christine Johnson. According to the investigation, the criminal noticed a beautiful young girl in a shopping center where he often hunted for victims and decided to act according to the usual scenario. He introduced himself as a film industry worker and offered Christine to audition for the role of James Bond's girl. Victor was remarkably convincing. Acting according to a well-established scheme, he showered the girl with compliments, assuring that she was perfect for this role. Given Christine's youth and ambitions, she believed the villain and could not refuse the tempting offer. Paleologos scheduled a meeting in one of the houses that he recently inspected with a realtor, explaining that this was where the audition would take place. Christine, somewhere deep down suspecting a trap, still prepared for the casting and dressed the way Victor asked. She arrived at the place with a slight delay, as she got lost on the way and contacted the directory service. This is how the girl found herself in the clutches of a deadly trap from which she never got out. During the meeting, Christine became a victim of Victor's harassment, but desperately resisted and even managed to scratch his face. But she had nowhere to run, and the physically stronger man quickly overcame the resistance. Paleologos dishonored the helpless girl, and then killed her to get rid of an unwanted witness. First, he hit her on the head and strangled her, and only then threw the mutilated body into the Hollywood Hills. But the most terrible thing was that the traumatic brain injury and strangulation did not lead to Christine's instant death. The girl only lost consciousness, and the inhuman victim mistook it for death. By throwing the body off a cliff, he doomed the victim to a slow and painful death. Christine, having fallen from a considerable height, received numerous fractures and internal injuries. She regained consciousness for some time, but never waited for rescue, bleeding to death alone. Only a few hours later, the girl finally died from her injuries. On May 12, 2003, the district attorney officially charged Victor Paleologos with kidnapping, violence, and first-degree murder. However, the defense was fully prepared to defend the client's innocence because there was a lack of direct evidence of his guilt. The prosecution faced a difficult battle, so forensic experts used all the available weighty arguments. Victor's lawyers questioned the time of the victim's death, referring to the insects found on the body. Instead, prosecutors emphasized the striking similarity of the killer's handwriting with previous attacks on women. The cases were so identical that it was impossible not to mention them in court. Preparation for the trial was delayed, so Victor Paleologos appeared before the jury only in July 2006. The defense emphasized that the prosecution actually had no material evidence against the defendant, no DNA analysis, no fingerprints, no video surveillance recordings that would link him to the murder. This was explained by the fact that Christine's mutilated body was found only 2 weeks after her disappearance, and during this time most of the traces had time to deteriorate. However, the testimony of women accusing Victor of harassment and attacks was more than enough. After their statements, the sympathies were on the side of the prosecution. Without exception, all the victims talked about Victor's remarkable talent for manipulation. The man was so careful and convincing that even the most cautious victims like Susan Murphy initially believed his sweet promises and agreed to take part in the alleged casting, not even suspecting what was really waiting for them. It seemed that after hearing this, no one had any doubts that it was Victor Paleologos who killed the unfortunate Christine. But the defendant had a last ace up his sleeve. To avoid the death penalty, Victor proposed to make a deal with the investigation and plead guilty to a less serious crime. Now the fate of Paleologos was in the hands of the relatives of the deceased girl. At that time, the exhausting trial had been going on for 3 weeks and threatened to drag on for a long time. Given the uncertainty of the verdict and the burden of the grief experienced, Christine's family agreed to make concessions in exchange for a confession. However, Victor unexpectedly changed his mind and on the day of sentencing sent the judge an 11-page petition asking to cancel his confession. Fortunately, the law was on the side of justice, and it was no longer possible to cancel the previous statement. The court found Victor Paleologos guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 25 years. Some crimes remain unsolved for years, even decades. Case files gather dust in police archives while the perpetrators continue living their lives, starting families and enjoying freedom, a privilege their victims are deprived of. Today, I'll tell you about a killer who managed to evade justice for over a decade and a half. But even he ultimately faced retribution. Rebecca Good was born on April 28, 1982 in the small town of Melbourne, Kansas, USA. With a population of barely 2,000 people, she was one of 4 daughters in the family. When the children were still very young, their parents decided to divorce. The process proved extremely unpleasant for all family members. The father made every effort to gain custody of his daughters, but the court sided with the mother. Despite the difficulties in separation, all the sisters maintained a relationship with their father. They were very close to each other and always took care of one another. As a teenager, Rebecca enrolled in a community college in Arkansas. To live closer to her place of study, she moved to the largest city of Fayetteville, with a population of around 100,000. Here, the girl pursued her education, worked part-time jobs, and prepared to enter university. Rebecca settled into an apartment with her younger sister Danielle, who was also her best friend. A couple weeks after moving, the sisters returned to their hometown of Melbourne to spend time with family and friends. 22-year-old Rebecca, after visiting with relatives, drove Danielle to her boyfriend's house and then went to see her own boyfriend Casey. At that point, they had been dating for about a year. Casey lived in a trailer located on his parents' property. They all had a wonderful weekend together. And then, little by little, they began getting ready to return to their usual work routines. On the morning of Monday, September 20, 2004, Rebecca drove her boyfriend to his job at a fast food restaurant. After that, the girl was seen buying breakfast. Rebecca stopped by a store where she ordered coffee and a sandwich. She planned to pack her things to head back home, where she and her sister were studying. Returning to her boyfriend's trailer, the girl decided to take a little nap feeling exhausted after an almost sleepless night. Around noon, Rebecca was supposed to pick up Danielle from her boyfriend's place, but the younger sister waited in vain for the older one. The girl assumed Rebecca's plans had changed, so by evening she made her own way to their parents' house. There she gathered some things for the trip and went to bed. The next morning, Danielle hoped to meet her older sister, but she never returned. The girl called Casey, but he hadn't spent the night at home and knew nothing about his girlfriend's whereabouts. The young man was certain Rebecca was long home by now. Other friends and acquaintances also denied seeing her. Hoping to find out if something had happened to her sister, Danielle called the sheriff's department. She reported that the girl had gone missing a little less than 24 hours ago. The police were immediately interested in what happened. Investigators began working through possible scenarios, gathering information from the reporting party. After talking to her, they decided to speak with the last person who saw Rebecca before she disappeared. The police went to Casey's workplace, the missing girl's boyfriend, since he was the last one to see Rebecca. However, the young man told law enforcement that the night before he had stayed at a friend's house, and in the morning he went straight to work. He knew the girl was supposed to leave with her sister and wasn't expecting her to return. But the detectives were alarmed by Casey's decision, especially considering he had a dog that needed care. The young man couldn't leave it for long, although there was someone on his parents' property to look after the animal. The police had no evidence to confirm their suspicions, but investigators still decided to inspect the trailer where the missing girl's boyfriend lived. They requested his consent to search. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed Rebecca's car parked nearby. Inside the trailer, there was a sharp smell of bleach. All the missing girl's things were in place. Her purse, money, cell phone, even the breakfast she bought, the coffee and sandwich, remained untouched. It seemed as if the student hadn't gone anywhere at all. Even her dog, a Pomeranian, was there, which she definitely couldn't have left unattended for long. In the bedroom, the police noticed the heavily crumpled bedding. The duvet was found in the washing machine with traces of blood. A bottle of bleach stood by the bed. Detectives looked under the mattress and saw large fresh red stains on it. Obviously, someone had recently flipped it over, trying to hide these traces. After this discovery, law enforcement's suspicions only strengthened. An examination showed that the blood on the mattress and bedding belonged to the missing girl. Casey became the main suspect in Rebecca's disappearance and probable murder, given the amount of blood found in his trailer. However, several colleagues and the young man's management confirmed that on the day of the disappearance, at 8 a.m., the girl had dropped him off at work. She was whole and unharmed, after which she went about her business and didn't return. The young man worked until 4:30 p.m., and when his shift ended, friends picked him up in a car. This was seen by several witnesses. Casey went to the movies with his buddies for an evening showing, and then they headed straight to one of the friends' houses. The tired young man went to bed and didn't get up until the morning of September 21. From there, he went directly to the fast food restaurant. The friend also confirmed Casey's alibi. It seemed the young man had solid proof of his non-involvement, so there were no grounds for arrest. But investigators still didn't completely rule him out as a suspect. They continued carefully examining the crime scene. All the girl's things remained in the trailer, with the exception of the suitcase she usually took with her on trips. Police suspected that the body could have been hidden in it. Another interesting detail was the absence of one of the legs of the piano that stood in the trailer. According to Casey, this leg had long been loose and would fall off if you bumped the instrument, but he didn't know where it had gone. Maybe it rolled somewhere. Among the versions regarding Rebecca's disappearance, the possibility of her running off with her ex-boyfriend Justin was also considered. The police contacted him, but the young man assured that he had not seen the missing girl and had not maintained any relationship with her for a long time. Meanwhile, the search for Rebecca continued, and a week later, law enforcement received alarming news. On September 27, 2004, the body of the 22-year-old student was found in a ravine near the road. A random witness came across a pit formed by a mound, at the bottom of which lay the dead girl. The victim of the brutal attack was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Rebecca had died about a week ago. This meant that it was on Monday, September 20, after she dropped her boyfriend off at work, that an unknown criminal attacked and killed her. The girl received 2 separate blows to the head with a blunt object. The first broke her nose, and the second was fatal, fracturing her skull. Numerous bruises were found on Rebecca's body, indicating a brutal beating. Interestingly, the shape of the injuries matched the mark that could have been left by the broken leg of the piano, which was not found in Casey's trailer. It was considered the murder weapon, but this piece of evidence could not be found next to the body. The medical examiner found no signs of resistance, so the girl apparently did not expect the attack. So the attack on her was committed by someone she knew, or she was attacked from behind. There were also no signs of sexual assault, so that was not the motive for the crime. Among Rebecca's injuries, a fracture of the hyoid bone was recorded, indicating prolonged and forceful strangulation. After the body was discovered, law enforcement again turned their attention to Casey. Witnesses reported that the girl had long wanted to break up with him, considering the young man to be the main cause of problems in the relationship. His possessive attitudes provoked most of the conflicts, which only intensified after Rebecca moved to another city to study. However, Casey had a reliable alibi. Nevertheless, detectives and many local residents were convinced that he was guilty of the brutal attack, since the murder took place in his house. Investigators desperately tried to link Casey to this tragedy, so they carefully checked all the information about him. But at every stage, the young man had confirmation of his alibi. He was seen by colleagues at work. Benny spent time with friends. There were tickets and payment receipts left. The next morning, Casey showed up at work again and spent the whole day there. His alibi ruled out the possibility of him committing any criminal acts against Rebecca, with whom he couldn't even have crossed paths, unless he slipped away from work unnoticed, but detectives considered that probability too low. Casey worked in a fast food restaurant, constantly in plain sight, so his absence would have been noticed immediately. It was assumed that the girl could have been attacked not on Monday morning, but on Sunday evening, when the young man had no alibi. But here too a contradiction arose. Eyewitnesses claimed that it was Rebecca who brought her boyfriend to work in her car on Monday morning. Moreover, she then stopped by the store to buy breakfast, where she was also seen. The salesman remembered the girl buying a sandwich and a donut, which were later found in her boyfriend's trailer. This confirmed that the employee was not mistaken. So the version about the attack on Sunday had to be quickly discarded. Everything indicated that Rebecca returned to the trailer, and it was there or somewhere nearby that she was attacked. After all her things remained inside, but no signs of a break-in were found in the dwelling, which meant that the girl most likely opened the door herself to someone she knew, or the door wasn't locked at all. Of course, after Casey, other members of his family who lived on the property where the trailer stood fell under suspicion. They all could have communicated and seen the girl, in fact had free access to the young man's home. But it turned out that the father of the family was out of town during that period. He worked as a truck driver and was on an intercity route. Casey's siblings also provided alibis that were quickly confirmed. It turned out that none of his relatives living on the property could have attacked the girl. Meanwhile, the police continued to communicate with the main suspect, Casey, trying to find out new details about the last days of Rebecca's life. The young man admitted that on Sunday evening he saw his cousin, 27-year-old William Miller. He was passing by and stopped for a few minutes at the driveway to talk. Although the visit was brief, investigators latched onto this information. Everything indicated that the victim knew her killer, and it could have been anyone. It became known that William had come to town to help his mother move back from Texas. He arrived that same evening and was in the city during the period of the girl's disappearance, which looked suspicious. Could William have had a motive for committing the crime? To get more information, detectives spoke with him, but couldn't find out anything new. He only confirmed talking to his cousin on Sunday evening, after which he left without seeing Rebecca. Another suspect was a girl named Jenny Furtner, who had long been at odds with Rebecca over her ex-boyfriend Justin. But this time, too, the police failed to find evidence of her involvement in the attack. At the time of the murder, she had a reliable alibi. Gathering information about the last days of the deceased's life, detectives learned that she had met with a guy named J.B. Etsy. There was no romantic relationship between them, but the young man sold her marijuana, for which she owed him $20. Investigators thought he might well have been involved in the murder over money. But during the conversation with him, nothing suspicious was found. The guy claimed that he would never have killed a young girl, even for an amount many times greater than the $20 debt. He successfully passed a polygraph test, so he was released. Another person investigators spoke to was Chris Cantrell. There were several witnesses who claimed he had bragged about an attack on a young student. Of course, the detectives were immediately interested in him. But during interrogation at the police station, Chris denied these claims, and the witnesses with their contradictory statements could not be found. After checking this man, he was released for lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. After this episode, the investigation reached a dead end. Despite public anxiety and pressure from the victims' relatives, the process stalled and did not move forward for several years. During this time, Rebecca's parents constantly reminded about themselves, repeatedly asking for police documents on the case. But they were refused. Eventually, the parents hired a private detective, hoping he could shed light on the circumstances of their daughter's tragic death. But even the professional failed to uncover new details of the bloody attack. Rebecca's relatives even announced a $25,000 reward for information that would help find the killer. But even this did not move the investigation from a dead end. Only in the late 2010s did the case unexpectedly receive a new impetus. Several podcasts covered the girl's brutal murder, drawing public attention to the unsolved crime. In 2018, another episode dedicated to Rebecca's death was released. The host, who was originally from the area, invited the deceased's relatives and friends to talk. They shared their versions of what could have happened. During the interview, one of the witnesses provided shocking information. He personally heard Casey bragging about killing Rebecca. According to this person, they worked together, and one time, when the young man got drunk, he confessed to the deed. But the credibility of this testimony was in doubt. First, Casey's confession allegedly took place 8 years ago, when he was intoxicated. Moreover, the witness was also under the influence. And despite all this, for some reason he did not report what he heard to the police. It's quite possible that his story for the podcast was just an attempt to attract attention to himself, to get publicity. In addition, it turned out that this witness's wife had an affair with Casey, so the man could just be looking for a way to get back at his rival. However, even this dubious information forced detectives to return to the investigation and take up the case with renewed vigor. In 2020, a new special agent with the Arkansas State Police was ordered to reopen the investigation into Rebecca's murder. He decided to start from scratch. First of all, he interrogated everyone who could have been involved in the crime. During numerous conversations, the investigator only confirmed the old alibis. And suddenly it turned out that the only person who was in Casey's trailer shortly before Rebecca's death and had no alibi was his cousin William Miller. The police had spoken to him back in 2004. But at the time he denied any involvement in the murder. Since then, William had been completely forgotten about. But it turned out that over the years he had divorced his wife and moved to the Philippines. There he got into a relationship with another woman, with whom he started a new family and had 2 children. In the Philippines, William owned a large farm of about 12 hectares, where the family raised livestock and tended plantations that provided them with a livelihood. The couple's older son spoke English quite well, while the younger daughter knew only a few phrases, preferring the local Bisaya language. William himself worked in the oil industry and taught at the School of Equatorial Hygiene. The police suspected that his life abroad was actually related to an attempt to avoid paying taxes. After all, although he was an employee of a North American company, being outside the United States, he did not have to pay taxes. So William constantly shuttled between the Philippines, West Africa, and the United States. He visited his homeland to see relatives, get treatment, and periodically appeared at the office of the oil company he worked for. In any case, the new investigator who took over the investigation was eager to talk to this suspicious man. Unfortunately, due to his constant traveling, it was not easy to contact him. The detective had to be patient and wait for William's return. Intuition told him that Casey's cousin might know more about the brutal attack of 2004 than he had told at the time. Back in 2019, several journalists created a social media group dedicated to this unsolved crime. Interestingly, William joined it quite quickly. Of course, he had no idea that he was under the close attention of the police, because the details of the reopened investigation were kept secret. William's name did not appear in any of the podcasts, and no one outside considered him a suspect. He was a little-known member of Casey's family, with whom few people communicated closely. Therefore, this person was simply forgotten about, but for detectives, he had long been on the list of potential criminals. On the day of the murder, William had been in town for several days, helping his mother move, and in fact had access to Casey's trailer. It was this fact that caught the attention of the new investigator, and also the fact that shortly after the crime, the suspect left the country, which also looked strange. When William joined the social media group, he immediately aroused the interest of other members. The fact is that all the subscribers knew each other, had their own close-knit community, and then suddenly a man who lived so far away in the Philippines and could hardly know anything about this case joined, so his excessive interest seemed suspicious. At the same time, William demonstrated a surprisingly good knowledge of the circumstances of the murder, was literally obsessed with this topic, time after time commenting on the details of the student's death, sending newspaper clippings and eyewitness accounts that other group members did not have access to and which had not yet been made public. Community subscribers claimed that William talked about the place where the girl's body was found and also shared his suspicions that Casey's neighbors were involved in the crime. This greatly alarmed the other members of the group. One of the girls, who was well versed in genealogy, analyzed the information and found that William was the cousin of the deceased's boyfriend. This discovery caused alarm in everyone. After considering the situation, the community members decided to pass the collected information to the Arkansas State Police. Law enforcement officials were interested in this information. William's behavior, his joining the group, his obsessive discussion of the murder theme resembled the actions of a criminal who monitors the progress of the investigation and tries to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But the police's hands were tied because the suspect was in another country and there was no way to interrogate him. Although there was an extradition agreement between the USA and the Philippines, more compelling grounds were needed to extradite a person. All that remained was to wait for William to return to the States on his own. In order not to miss his arrival, law enforcement officials warned the customs services. The man's passport was entered into the appropriate database. It was assumed that the system would automatically report his appearance at the border, and then customs officers would quickly contact the police. And so it happened. In October 2020, William flew to Arkansas to visit his family, who now lived there. The detective learned of his arrival. When police called the suspect's mother, she assured that her son had not appeared in the country for over a year. But this was a lie because law enforcement officials already knew that he had crossed the U.S. border. Later, the woman explained her insincerity by the fact that she did not believe in the conversation with the police and thought that some ill wishers of William were trying to find him. Eventually, the police managed to arrange a meeting with William at the station on November 7, which he attended. Finding himself in the interrogation room, the suspect immediately declared his readiness to cooperate and provide any information necessary for the investigation. He assured that he had nothing to hide. Despite the fact that the man was suspected of murder, the detectives initially decided not to focus on this. The conversation began casually, from afar, with innocent questions in order to win over the suspect and give him the opportunity to open up. At first, the investigators were interested in William's current life and his frequent moods. He talked about his busy schedule and life, gradually relaxing. Further, the detectives showed interest in his work, place of residence and daily routine at the time of Rebecca's murder. William reported that he was then working on a 7-on-7-off schedule, that is, a week of 10-12 hours a day, and then the same amount of rest. Shortly before the tragic death of the student, his mother moved from Arkansas to Texas, and he helped her with the move. But she did not like the new state, so the woman decided to return back. William used one of his weeks off to help his mother return home. That is why he found himself in the city during the period when Rebecca Good was murdered. The police gradually approached the most important questions. It turned out that William was not very close to his cousins, although they occasionally met and communicated. According to him, he had been to his cousin's trailer only a few times, but did not remember this happening in 2004. Then the police tried to clarify the circumstances of William's meeting with Casey in September 2004. He confirmed that he did visit him while living in the house with his mother. According to the suspect, he had little communication with his cousin because he was constantly working. William saw him and the girl only in the evening, and it seemed to him as if they had some kind of quarrel. However, this aroused even more suspicion, because the young people's loved ones claimed that they did not quarrel that evening. William said that he had been to his cousin's trailer several times, but did not mention to the police about communicating with him on September 19, the day before Rebecca's death. He kept silent about this until the very end, and the detectives also did not tell him about their awareness. They tried to lead the suspect to a confession. According to William, he arrived in Kansas only on the evening of Sunday, September 19, when it was already getting dark, and stayed with his mother. In the morning, they took his younger brother to school together, and then spent the whole day packing things. On Tuesday, William rented several trucks for the move. It was during this period that police officers who came to search began working around his cousin's trailer. But he never mentioned seeing Casey and Rebecca. After that, the detectives told about their awareness of the communication between Casey and William on September 19, 2004. However, the suspect began to deny that he did not remember exactly and suggested that this meeting took place at a different time. The detectives continued to maintain a relaxed atmosphere and asked the man to provide DNA samples. He immediately refused, explaining that his DNA could have remained on the furniture items during his cousin's visit. The detectives explained to William that they would compare the DNA not with samples from the furniture, but with specific physical evidence from the crime scene. But they still could not convince him. In fact, no DNA of the killer was found at the crime scene, so the detectives just wanted to check his reaction. At the same time, the suspect agreed to take a polygraph test. Before the test began, he was clearly nervous. William claimed that he was taking medications that affected his blood pressure, so he was afraid of the low accuracy of the results. However, in reality, such problems do not affect the effectiveness of the test, which he was informed about. The polygraph examiner managed to calm the suspect down, but this did not help him successfully pass the test. William failed the polygraph, which automatically increased the police's suspicions. The interrogation continued. The investigators were determined to break the suspect. To do this, they used the same tactic that they used on Casey in the first year after the girl's murder. Then they photographed his car and tried to convince the young man that Rebecca's blood was found on the gas pedal. Of course, this was a trick to get the criminal to give himself away, but it didn't work with Casey. He continued to argue that it was possible, so the police assumed that the young man was indeed innocent. To pull the same thing on William, they had to track down and photograph his old pickup truck, which he owned at the time of the crime. When the police played the same trick, informing him that Rebecca's blood was found on the pedal of his car, it worked. The man suddenly began to stutter, get confused in his testimony. He was even more nervous, and his story instantly changed. As soon as the suspect believed that Rebecca's blood was found in his old car, he said that on the day of the crime he saw an unknown young man. He arrived in a white car, which he left near the back porch of the house. William saw the suspicious man quickly disappear from the scene alone, and he thought that his cousin's trailer had been robbed. When he ran inside to make sure of this, he saw not the consequences of a robbery, but blood on the bedding. In his opinion, Rebecca was attacked and kidnapped, and then probably killed. Of course, the detectives could not believe it, because according to his confession, the criminal acted alone. Moreover, there was no reason to hide this information for 16 years. When he was exposed in a lie, William stated that he was ready to confess. According to him, on Monday morning he went hunting in the woods behind his grandfather's house. He knocked on the trailer where Rebecca was and asked to use the phone. Suspecting nothing, the girl let him in. However, this was a trick because he wanted to hunt for more interesting prey Rebecca. He was very nervous, so he accidentally touched the piano, and its leg broke off and fell. Then he grabbed the girl and beat her half to death, and then strangled her with golf clubs to make sure she was dead. After the massacre, he packed the body in a suitcase. He cleaned up the crime scene, collected the bloody bedding, sent some of it to the laundry. He turned the mattress over, took the body out in his pickup truck and threw it into a ravine. Moreover, on the way, he drove past the police station, not even afraid that he might be noticed or accidentally stopped. On the way back, he got rid of the piano leg and suitcase, indicating the place. The criminal just continued to live as if nothing had happened. He returned home in such a way that his mother did not even notice her son's absence while packing things. Then they made the move as planned. The motives for the brutal murder of Rebecca remained a mystery. William categorically denied any intentions to abuse the girl. Valuables were also not stolen from the crime scene. The suspect claimed that it was a spontaneous attack of aggression that got out of control. According to him, Rebecca did not provoke or offend him in any way, so there were no obvious reasons for the attack. William just wanted to shed someone else's blood. For a long time, the police were puzzled by one question. Why did William, having arrived in the Philippines and learning from his mother about the officer's call, not run away, but agreed to meet with the detectives? The man admitted that for many years he had been lying to everyone about this incident in order to make sure of his inviolability. He was absolutely sure that his involvement in the crime could not be proven. Therefore, without any hesitation, William appeared at the police station, hoping to finally remove all suspicions from himself and live carefree on. When the suspect was finally exposed, the investigators decided to use another cunning trick. The criminal acted too confidently, methodically, and accurately. There was a suspicion that William might have other crimes behind him. The detectives hinted to him that they were aware of his involvement in a number of other murders. Surprisingly, this tactic worked. As it turned out,
This seemingly ordinary family man and father was a real serial killer. According to William himself, he took the life of his first victim at the age of 20. Since then, the man had constantly stalked pretty blonde girls, whom he brutally beat and strangled to death. Police officers unfolded a map of the area in front of the suspect. William, without hesitation, marked several points on it where, according to him, the bodies of the dead girls could be found. In total, he indicated 6 burial sites of the victims. 4 of them, according to the killer, were girls of easy virtue, and 2 were random passers by whom he chose for no apparent reason. Later, William let slip that in addition to these victims, there could be 5 more girls whose disappearances occurred under similar circumstances. According to the suspect, he never robbed his victims. He chose girls who provided intimate services only because they were easy to lure into a trap, and hardly anyone would look for them after they disappeared. He admitted that he felt incredible excitement at the moment when the victims undressed, and then suddenly attacked from behind and strangled them with their own clothes. At this point, William's revelations about the fate of other victims stopped. He no longer wanted to talk to the investigators. The court took into account all the evidence, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to release.
A young Italian woman, Veronica Panarello, faced numerous challenges in her life. At the age of 16, she met Davide Stival at a bar, who immediately caught her eye, and she quickly opened up to him. Despite the 4-year age difference, the couple conversed as if they had known each other for a long time. Despite the girl's youth, they started a relationship. Within 3 months, Veronica was already begging to start a family. The girl had no doubts. She wanted a child from David. He agreed and they moved in together. Soon, Veronica became pregnant. In 2006, when she was only 17 and he was 21, their son Loris was born. It was then that Veronica's family began to experience problems. Constant conflicts with her parents and the desire to run away from home, intensified with the birth of the out-of-wedlock child. However, the young girl created a semblance of a family, contrary to the expectations of her elders. To the surprise of their relatives, the young couple's affairs were going quite well. Terrible trials lay ahead. But for now, Veronica tried to give her son everything he needed. Over time, the couple officially legalized their marriage. The young mother became pregnant again and gave birth to a second boy, whom they named Diego. Veronica essentially remained under the care of her parents. Although Davide worked, his efforts were not enough to provide for his wife and 2 children. The parents from both sides supported the couple in every possible way, primarily financially. Veronica, on the other hand, did not even think about looking for a job, having completely devoted herself to the children and the household. Her husband considered her an exemplary, industrious, neat, and loving wife. The children grew up, having genuinely warm relationships with their mother. She spent all her free time with them, although sometimes it resembled more of a friendship between peers. Probably because of the too early age of motherhood, there is an opinion that Veronica was still in a rebellious mood, which is why conflicts with her parents escalated. The elders believed that she would not become a full-fledged mother if she perceived everything as a game. But any attempts to get through to her ended in hysterics. The couple lived in a rural area with a population of 10,000 inhabitants, the town of Santa Croce Camarina in southern Italian Sicily, where everyone knew each other. For such a cozy corner, such early motherhood seemed strange. However, no one suspected that this reckless youthful haste would lead to the terrible tragedy that we will tell you about. On November 29, 2014, at noon, Veronica Panarello appeared at the police station. The 25-year-old woman reported the disappearance of her 8-year-old son Loris. According to her, in the morning, as always, she had brought the boy to school. He went inside with the other students. Then she took her younger son to kindergarten. Loris was supposed to be at school until 12:30. When the woman came to pick him up, her son was nowhere to be found. The mother became alarmed and could not find him. Immediately after that, Veronica decided to go to the police and write a statement about the disappearance of the 8-year-old boy. Law enforcement officers immediately contacted the school, but no teacher or employee had seen Loris that day. The students also confirmed that they had not met him either near the school or in class. Some thought that the boy was skipping classes. Others assumed that he could have been kidnapped. However, no one believed that Loris would voluntarily get into an unfamiliar car. He was too smart for that. So the question arose, how could he have ended up on the street if his mother had taken him to the school door and saw him go inside? At that time, her 29-year-old husband, Davide Stival, was working as a driver and was on a trip in Rome. The Carabinieri immediately called him, and the man was shocked by the news. It turned out that his wife had not even informed him. Then he called Veronica himself, and she confirmed Loris's disappearance. David immediately got on a plane to get to the city as quickly as possible. As soon as he landed, he saw a post on his wife's social media with a photo of her and their son. It was an announcement that the boy had been found dead. Loris's body was found 4 hours after the police report. It had been thrown into a ditch near an old mill. The place was just minutes away from the couple's house by car. It was accidentally discovered by an elderly man who was hunting in the area. During his usual walk through the forest, he noticed something suspicious in the mud. As he approached, the witness realized that it was not just a discarded object, but the body of a child. The man immediately informed the police about the discovery. At the scene, criminologists found the child's mutilated body, unnaturally twisted in the ditch, with his pants pulled down and no underwear. Law enforcement officers immediately suspected a sexual motive for the crime. Investigators believed that they were dealing with a child molester. However, unlike typical perverts, he not only raped his victims, but also killed them. This made the criminal twice as dangerous. News of the tragedy quickly spread through the town, sowing panic among the inhabitants. The realization that every child could become a target of a predator instilled fear and forced people to change their usual way of life. The news of the murder in the small village instantly flew around all of Italy. The country's central TV channels talked about the victim. This event became one of the loudest newsworthy events of 2014, stirring up the public. Society demanded that the police catch the criminal as soon as possible and bring him to justice. Meanwhile, detectives, working tirelessly, searched for the monster capable of such an act to calm the community. The investigators working on the case immediately noticed some strange details. The crime was clearly not committed according to the classic scheme characteristic of typical rapists and maniacs. The strangest thing was not even the absence of the child's underwear. After removing it, the criminal put the pants back on the body. Such abusers do indeed often collect the victim's belongings, but they almost never put the clothes back on after taking the trophy. Moreover, no similar cases had been observed in this area before. The police turned their attention to the family of the deceased. Veronica and Davide were decent people. Everyone knew them as a loving young family. Despite the fact that the child was born when the mother was a minor, now she had become an adult woman and really gave the impression of a devoted mother. In any case, under such circumstances, the most valuable information can be provided by the family itself. So the investigators came to talk to the parents of the murdered boy. Here, the police found out that Davide spent very little time at home. Due to his work as a driver, he was with his family for no more than 50 days a month. Almost all the free time, the children were with their mother. Thus, the young woman was constantly left alone, without a husband. It was not easy for her to cope with household chores and raising children on her own. The woman often complained about the difficulties. Against the background of her loneliness, rumors about lovers spread through the town. However, during the check, it was not possible to confirm this information. At the Stival family's house, the police found Veronica. According to Davide, this tragedy had destroyed her. The young mother was constantly crying and refusing to eat. Subsequently, this led to exhaustion. The young woman was taken to the hospital, where she had to be given special IV drips with a nutritious solution so that she would not die. The police saw her during this period. She really looked bad. Veronica was emotionally broken. It even manifested physically. Huge dark circles formed under her eyes and her skin took on an unhealthy pallor. During this period, Loris's younger brother Diego was still living with the family. However, later, the parents took him to his grandparents, as the mother was in an unstable mental state. She did not take care not only of herself, but also ignored the needs of the child. The husband supported his wife all this time and was forced to quit his job. Despite the difficulty with which the Stiefel family was experiencing the loss of a child, the investigators decided to bring both parents to the place where Loris's body was found. The police made video recordings. They believed that this trip could provide useful data. In the video, you can see not even Veronica, but literally the shadow of a person. So hard was she experiencing the loss of her son. Horatio Fedone got on the list of suspects. He was the same elderly hunter who discovered the child's body. The detectives suspected him because the man had led them to the victim, just 4 hours after the boy was declared missing. Of course, it could have been a coincidence, but it was worth making sure how the man managed to find the deceased so quickly. The investigators launched a large-scale check but could not find a connection between the hunter and the evidence. He successfully passed a polygraph test, had a confirmed alibi for the morning of Loris's disappearance, and his fingerprints and DNA were not found on the boy's body. However, the heightened interest in Horatio Fedone led to local residents starting to accuse Veronica of having an intimate relationship with his grandson, and even with him. In the end, after rather harsh checks, all suspicions were removed from Horatio. The detectives were convinced that Horatio had indeed accidentally stumbled upon the boy. He had the misfortune to be in that place just a few hours after Loris was declared missing. At the same time, the investigation ran out of assumptions and leads. No traces indicating the perpetrator could be found, so it was decided to call in reinforcements of Carabinieri from Rome to join the investigation. The new participants in the case, having studied all the materials, believed that the mother was involved in the disappearance of her son. They immediately drew attention to the problems in the relationship between Veronica and her relatives. The grandparents told the investigators that the deceased boy had told them about a strange experiment at school. According to the child, his mother had bought plastic zip ties needed for classes. The boy talked about this literally the day before his disappearance. This seemed suspicious because zip ties are quite a dangerous object and are prohibited from being used in school. When the detectives asked the teachers about this experiment, it turned out that they really had not planned anything like that and would not have needed any cable ties. Eventually, the investigators decided that the child had made them up. But after receiving the report from the forensic experts, the investigators remembered these items. According to the specialists who performed the autopsy, the time of the child's death fell between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning on the day he disappeared. The cause of the boy's death was strangulation by some foreign object of small thickness, tightened around his neck. It looks very much like he was strangled with cable ties. Then the investigators suggested that there might be a connection between these two facts. The forensic expert believed that the murder was committed somewhere near the place where the body was found, since the injuries from the fall were received almost immediately after death, or he was thrown out while still alive and died a little later. The detectives assumed that the child could really, for some reason, have wanted to get these ties and made up a story about their need at school. Then Loris would have had to carry them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about this? It raised great doubts that the killer attacked the boy, grabbed his backpack, and began to look for a murder weapon there. The Carabinieri considered it necessary to find the blue backpack, believing that it would give new clues. To do this, they blocked all the landfills where waste was brought from Santa Croce Camarina. In the end, it took the police several days to examine the dumps, but they never managed to find the boy's blue backpack. In addition to information about strangulation, the forensic medical examination made it possible to find out another strange circumstance. Despite the absence of underwear and the lowered pants, no signs of sexual violence or traces of the DNA of the probable pervert were found. From that moment on, the police had doubts about the previous version of events. They were still looking for the criminal, but already understood that this was not a typical maniac or molester. It no longer seemed that the crime was committed on sexual grounds. It was necessary to compile a full psychological profile of the killer. However, At this stage of the investigation, the information turned out to be too confusing, and it was problematic to do this. The solution suggested itself. The detectives decided to trace the path that the mother and child were moving on the day of the massacre. Despite the fact that it was a very small provincial town, Veronica and Loris were moving along the central street, where many houses had surveillance cameras installed. Of course, it took a lot of time to collect and view the recordings. It is clear that law enforcement officers tried to notice a third person following a woman with her son in a black Volkswagen Polo. Perhaps a suspicious car was following them. However, no matter how hard the investigators tried, they could not notice anything unusual that would be of interest to them. However, quite quickly, the detectives drew attention to several strange things. Firstly, they never managed to see the moment when the boy enters the school, although the mother continued to insist that she allegedly took him almost to the threshold of the educational institution. It became clear that Veronica was lying, and they did not reach the school that morning. After viewing dozens of hours of recordings, the investigators saw that only the younger child got out of the car near the kindergarten. The detectives continued to analyze the camera recordings from the entire district in search of clues. So they saw how at one of the intersections that Veronica was supposed to pass, she turned towards the church, not far from which the victim was later found. This seemed strange because for many years before that, she had used a different road. What could have forced the young mother to change her preferences on the very day when her son was found dead? This aroused certain suspicions among the Carabinieri. At this stage, the police officers decided not to disclose the discovered information so as not to startle Veronica, but began to consider the young woman as a suspect. Experienced policemen decided to immediately check the veracity of her words. To do this, Veronica was asked to drive with the investigators along the same route that she used on the day of the child's death so that she could show everything personally. They already knew the route as they had managed to completely restore it with the help of recordings from video surveillance cameras. The woman agreed, and they began to conduct a reconstruction of events. When the police car, together with Veronica, drove up to that decisive intersection where she changed her preferences, the woman lied. The detectives investigating the murder of 8-year-old Loris Stivel began to suspect his mother, Veronica Panarello, after discovering that she had lied about her route on the morning her son disappeared. During the investigative experiment, the woman indicated that she was moving along the usual path, although the surveillance camera recordings showed otherwise. The police decided to search the Stivel family's house and interrogate Veronica at the station. The young mother was outraged to learn that she was considered a likely killer of her own child. She insisted on her innocence, stating that under no circumstances would she have harmed her son. However, the investigators had reason to think otherwise. During the hours-long interrogation, Veronica admitted that she had dropped off her elder son Loris half a kilometer from the school that morning because she was in a hurry. According to her, someone could have attacked the boy on the way. The woman also denied being near the ravines where her son's body was found, assuring that she was not at all familiar with that area. However, the suspect's sister refuted these statements, saying that in childhood they often visited there and knew those places well. Veronica's presence in the crime area was also confirmed by surveillance camera recordings. David Stival, the father of the deceased boy, at first could not believe in his wife's involvement in the murder of their son. After viewing the video recordings, he recognized Veronica and the children, who left the house in the morning. But instead of taking Loris to school, the woman turned him back home. He was no longer visible on the recordings. Then Veronica took the younger child to the kindergarten and returned. Contrary to her habit, she drove into the garage in reverse rather than leaving the car in front of the house. According to the investigators, it was at this time between 9 and 10 in the morning that the crime occurred. Loris was not at school and stayed at home, and when his mother drove into the garage, she was doing something out of the camera's view. Despite all the evidence, Veronica continued to deny her guilt, insisting that she had taken her elder son to school and her younger son to kindergarten, after which she returned home.
She suggested that Loris could have been kidnapped right outside the school. But the police did not believe this because they saw on the video how at 9:23 Veronica left the house again, and just 2 minutes later she was heading towards the old mill, where her son's body was soon found. Returning home at 9:38, she was definitely alone. Given the speed of events, the boy most likely was no longer breathing when he was thrown into the ditch. At 9:41, Veronica was already on her way to her usual cooking classes. She left early to arrive by the start of classes at 10 in the morning and not arouse suspicion. There, no one noticed any changes in her behavior. GPS data from Veronica's phone and car confirmed her movements established by the investigators. Unfortunately, the collected evidence was not yet sufficient for an official accusation, so the young mother was simply placed under arrest, and law enforcement officers continued to search for irrefutable evidence. At some point, it seemed that the suspect was about to be exposed, but suddenly, a policewoman who was on duty near the school turned to the station. She claimed that she had seen Veronica dropping Loris off at the educational institution on the day of the murder. However, the investigators did not trust these statements too much because they contradicted the video recordings. The policewoman could have simply confused the days since Veronica performed the same actions every morning. Meanwhile, the main suspect was behind bars, desperately proving her innocence. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown. When the carabinieri told David about the discrepancies in his wife's route, he also acknowledged her behavior as suspicious and sided with the investigation. The police saw this as an opportune moment to obtain a confession. They understood that the suspect most likely trusted her husband, so they decided to arrange a meeting between them, during which Davide would try to elicit some new details from his wife. After all, Veronica was the only person who had complete information about the events of that tragic morning. David agreed that it was a good idea, but noted that he did not seek his wife's conviction. 1 month after the brutal murder of 8-year-old Loris Stivel, on January 6, 2015, his father David came to meet with his arrested wife Veronica. Despite the fact that according to Italian law he had no right to be in prison, the police made an exception, hoping that it would help solve the crime. Veronica didn't even greet her husband, but immediately asked if he had a microphone for eavesdropping. Davide denied it and proved the absence of any recording devices. In fact, they were not needed because the meeting was being filmed by a prison surveillance camera. The suspect continued to insist on her innocence and version of events. She incessantly repeated to everyone, the police, the lawyer, her husband, relatives who visited her in prison, that she had taken her son to school and did not know what had happened to him next. The detectives could not prove the mother's involvement in the massacre. Even the motive itself raised doubts. Everyone who knew Veronica characterized her as a decent woman who sincerely loved her sons. Of course, there were various rumors, but the investigators checked every word and found no confirmation of the gossip. Veronica was indeed a caring mother. The only lead that seemed plausible to the detectives to explain the crime could be depression or emotional instability. The main suspect was indeed in a very depressed state, which only worsened due to her imprisonment. The investigation had reached a dead end, and it occurred to the investigators to allow the mother to visit the child's grave to say goodbye to him. Veronica was taken to the cemetery, accompanied by a whole motorcade of 10 cars with flashing lights on. It seemed as if a dangerous maniac was being transported through the city. A listening device was installed on the tombstone, of course. The officers were sure that by leaving the mother alone with her deceased son, they would hear an apology or a confession of murder. And Veronica started talking. But these were not at all the words that the police expected to hear. She was sobbing, praying, and swearing that she knew her boy's killer and would punish him. This came as a complete surprise to the carabinieri. Later, she was put in a car to be taken back to her cell. On the way, the young mother suddenly reported that at her son's grave she had some kind of insight. She admitted that she had begun to recall the events of that fatal day, which had previously eluded her memory. However, Veronica was not going to share this with the detectives. Instead, she expressed a desire to meet with her husband again.
On November 6, 2015, David visited Veronica again. Of course, like all visits behind prison walls, this meeting was also recorded. This time, the main suspect admitted for the first time that she thought she had not taken the child to school at all on the day of his disappearance. The woman complained about difficulties in expressing her thoughts as she found herself in an unusual state. According to Veronica, that morning she seemed to have fallen out of reality and everything around her seemed shrouded in fog. From her fragmentary memories, she was able to recreate how she took her younger son to kindergarten and then returned home, where Loris was supposed to be. She left her elder son at home because he did not want to go to school. But when she returned, Veronica did not find the boy. Being in a strange state, she thought that she had already taken him to school, but realized her mistake when she came to pick up the child from school, and he was not there. The police, of course, did not believe the new version, but were convinced that they were moving in the right direction. It almost resembled the very confession they had needed for a whole year to bring the killer to justice. They considered her excuse of memory loss an attempt to mitigate her guilt and get a shorter sentence than she deserved. However, not everyone shared this point of view, since the woman's condition really caused concern. Unfortunately, the younger son was still too young and could not testify to the police about whether he had seen his brother that day. Despite their confidence in Veronica's involvement in the murder, the Carabinieri decided to meet her halfway and suggested going home in the hope that it would help unlock new memories. She was led through the rooms, which remained unchanged from the day of the boy's death. When the main suspect entered Loris's room, something theatrical began to happen. She started speaking in her son's voice and reproducing the dialogues that she allegedly had with him that morning. The detectives saw how emotionlessly she was doing it, and at that moment they became convinced that before them was a true pathological liar and manipulator who was once again trying to lead the investigation away from the truth. But could she, being in her right mind, have been deceiving everyone for more than a year? During this time, dozens of specialists had spoken with the suspect. Despite the fact that the police officers were not sure about the reliability of the new version of events told by the young mother, many still believe in it to this day. According to Veronica, after returning home from the kindergarten, she started washing baby bottles. Her elder son Loris did not want to go to school, so the woman allowed him to spend the whole day at home. While the mother was doing household chores, the boy was in his room. Veronica did not hear anything suspicious, but when she entered her son's room sometime later, she saw his blue body with cable ties tightened around his neck. The child had probably been playing with them and tried to tighten them around his neck. The ties were connected to each other like a necklace. As the woman recounted, her son froze with frightened eyes. He was pulling on one of the ends of the ties, thinking that this way he would be able to open them, but in fact, he was only tightening the deadly trap even more. The mother knew how they worked, but realized that she would not be able to tear them apart with her hands, so she ran to the kitchen for scissors. When the story's heroine returned and cut the fatal ribbon, the boy was no longer showing signs of life. He had lost consciousness and was not breathing. According to Veronica's confession, she had a panic attack. She immediately took her cell phone and tried to dial the emergency service number. However, she was shaking so much that she simply could not dial the number. Her fingers were missing the buttons, and the numbers were blurring before her eyes. After all this, Veronica realized that she would be the one blamed for what had happened. Being in an inadequate state, she decided to get rid of her son's body. Later, the forensic medical examination confirmed the presence of scratches on the child's face and neck. They resembled real attempts to tear off the cable ties from him with fingernails. Unfortunately, the ties had cut too deep into the skin, so it was impossible to tear them off with hands. According to the investigators, in a panic, the mother could have pulled on one of the ends of the ties herself, which further aggravated the situation and finally cut off the access to oxygen. At this stage, the police decided to clarify the information and, if possible, awaken new memories, so Veronica and Davide were again taken to the place where Loris was found. Here, The mother admitted that she had indeed thrown the child into the ravine, but continued to deny that she had dealt with him herself. She still could not explain why the boy had no underwear. This circumstance did not fit into her story in any way. It also raised great doubts as to why an 8-year-old intelligent child would put these ties around his neck, tighten them more and more, and not even call for help. Later, the suspect recalled that the ravine turned out to be too deep, so the pants accidentally slipped off the body, and it twisted as the boy rolled to the bottom. At the trial, the prosecution tried to refute the mother's confession. Her uncharacteristic behavior was the most alarming. Veronica parked the car in the garage in a very unusual way, so that it was really convenient to load the body unnoticed. However, this happened at a moment when she could not yet have known about her son's death. According to her confession, he died later. In the opinion of the prosecution, this indicated the intentional nature of the murder. The defense continued to insist that the mother did not kill the child, but that he himself died due to negligence. Realizing the severity of what had happened, Veronica simply got scared. The woman was in a state of shock, so she took the body out and threw it away. However, she could not answer one of the key questions. The prosecution could not understand why she took the underwear off the boy and then put his pants back on. According to Veronica, she simply did not remember this. The prosecutor considered her actions an attempt to stage an attack on the boy by a rape in order to lead the investigation along the wrong path. Initially, her plan worked, and the police were looking for such a criminal, but later they realized that it was part of the staging. During the trial of this case, an unexpected plot twist emerged. Veronica admitted that Loris was killed by the boy's grandfather on his father's side, named Andrea Stiefel. She allegedly had an affair with her husband's father. That day, the child caught them having sex and began to threaten that he would tell his father everything. Andrea Stiefel, the boy's paternal grandfather, allegedly attacked his grandson in a fit of anger and strangled him. Despite this strange turn of events, law enforcement officers were forced to check the accused's statement. They turned to the surveillance camera recordings again. Thus, the investigators found out that none of the men had entered the house that morning. However, in the footage where Veronica was leaving the house around 9:30, a dark silhouette was indeed visible in the back seat of the car. The Carabinieri were forced to involve specialists for the analysis of the video recordings, but they claimed that it was not the shadow of a person, but glare on the car windows. Andrea Stiefel himself denied both the connection with his son's wife and the murder of his grandson. He stated that this was another lie of a crazy woman. The grandfather had a confirmed alibi. In addition, there was no correspondence or even calls between the so-called lovers, which also refuted Veronica's words. Therefore, no one believed this new version of the defendant. Veronica's behavior suggested that the investigation was dealing with a person with mental disorders. Her strange behavior was emphasized by all the officers and specialists who communicated with her. One of the detectives recalled that during one of the interrogations, the woman suddenly began to sing, and also repeatedly her calm and loud speech changed to an indistinct mumbling under her breath with a blank look. Veronica seemed to periodically fall out of reality and could start smoking an imaginary cigarette. The defendant's mother said that Veronica had previously had mental problems. From an early age, she was repeatedly sexually abused by boys. At the age of 14, the girl tried to take her own life by drinking bleach after a quarrel with her school friends. The following year, she tried to hang herself in a greenhouse. Veronica underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic. Once she called her mother and asked her to pick her up because the paramedic had allegedly raped her. But these accusations did not receive any confirmation, and no one believed the girl. A psychiatric examination showed that Veronica acted in a cold-blooded, prudent, and cruel manner. No serious mental disorders were found in her that would allow her to be declared insane. The trial lasted a whole 4 years due to constant postponements and additional investigations. Based on the results of the trial, she was found guilty of premeditated murder and concealment of the body. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. After that, another performance took place. Obviously, the child's grandfather, whom Veronica referred to as the criminal, was in the courtroom. The defendant did not agree with the verdict, so she stood up and again began to accuse the man of all those absurd things that she had already voiced earlier in court. She was removed from the courtroom and sent behind bars. Veronica is still in prison, keeping the terrible truth of the death of the 8-year-old boy, which we will probably never know. However, most of the investigators who worked on this case believe that it was not an accident, but a planned, brutal murder. Probably, on that day, the son did not want to go to school. This had happened before. It was not the first case of him skipping. On this basis, the mother quarreled with her son and strangled him with ties in a fit of anger, and then got rid of the body, deliberately removed his underwear to confuse the investigation. But since the ties were purchased in advance, perhaps it all looked even more ominous and indicated the planning of the murder. The boy's father stated after the trial that his life was destroyed because he had simultaneously lost his son, wife, and job. The man is still not sure that it was Veronica who killed the boy. He did not understand what could have been the reason for killing his son. David had never seen his wife display violence towards the children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he is trying to live for the sake of his younger son, in whose upbringing his parents are helping him. The story of Veronica Panarello and her son Loris is a tragic tale of how impulsive decisions, lack of maturity, and emotional instability can lead to devastating consequences. This case serves as a cautionary tale for all parents about the importance of responsible parenting and the need to overcome one's own psychological issues for the safety and well-being of their family. The main cause of this tragedy was Veronica's inability to cope with the challenges of motherhood at such a young age. Her emotional immaturity, possible mental disorders, and lack of proper support from loved ones created a dangerous combination of factors that ultimately led to the child's death. To prevent such tragedies, it is crucial that young parents have access to the resources and support necessary for raising children. This includes parenting education, emotional support, counseling, and assistance in case of psychological issues. Society as a whole should pay more attention to the mental health and well-being of families, especially those facing additional challenges such as early and unplanned pregnancies.